And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have everyone here. Wow, what a fantastic crowd it is already. And we're going to do something very special tonight, which is that we're going to... there it is. You hear an echo in there? We're going to do something special with this episode, which is we're going deep into the eighth sphere. Now, we've touched on the eighth sphere in a couple of shows here, but every time you go into the eighth sphere, you're only scratching the surface because there are so many different layers to it. And one of the key layers I think we have to keep in mind in relation to this is that it was brought out accidentally from the mystery schools, and then the mystery schools on the right-hand side had to kind of come in and save the day and explain exactly what the eighth sphere was all about and give us that warning that ties in so much with the AI and transhumanism that we see rampant here in the 21st century with robot bartenders and driverless cars just around the corner, just about there. So we're on the X episode 42. This is the X Steganography series, and it's great to be with you on this one because what's going to happen by the end of this is we're going to take a number of themes out of those first 42 episodes and thread them all together so we get a really big kind of coherent picture out of where the X Steganography is leading us. As usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And you know, Olivia's going to be taking your questions tonight for the second half of the program. And during the second half of the show, what you want to do basically all during the show is just, you can ask your questions, but make sure they're all in caps because they're easy for her to grab and kind of pull out and make a kind of a QA script for us in the second half of the program. How's it going out there? It's a pretty...
You want a question right away?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Cherry Mahanji says, is it correct to assume that the young women who trained in the Orphic Circle and who were from the upper classes escaped, for the most part, the hard hits of patriarchy?
Interesting. Well, you bring up a key area, which is the Orphic Circle, which we brought to light on this program, especially in the Alice in Wonderland episode last summer. But we get a lot of this information predominantly about the Orphic Circle from Emma Britton, who was the leading founder, along with Helena Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott of the Theosophical Society. Now, the Orphic Circle trained young women, usually between the ages of 9 and 14, to go into a kind of somnambulous trance state. And in that state, these people in the Orphic Circles, including prime ministers and pretty ranking literary figures of the day, including Bulwer Lytton and people like Charles Dickens, they would be able to put questions to the somnambulist and to get these deep answers channeled back to them while the somnambulist was in this state. So one of the key things I think that we're looking at when we get to the Orphic Circle is a deep, deep knowledge of that psychic interface. And the way that they selected the people to be in that Orphic Circle is also quite fascinating. They usually would have to have some kind of bloodline indication about their abilities. So in the case of Emma Britton, she was particularly powerful as a clairvoyant and as a trance channel. And in fact, Madame Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society, said that she never met a better trance channel, which is quite a compliment coming from her, where the compliments did not come fast and heavy for anyone. So we get some idea there of the information that Emma Britton brings forward about the Orphic Circle. We can really take that to the bank. And in terms of, you know, would they have kind of missed out on this whole patriarchal society that was going on in the 19th century? I think when you look at Emma's account, which is in her autobiography, which is quite remarkable, you get the impression that her early days were spent in a very unusual fashion. That is, she wasn't allowed friends. She had to study music on a regular basis, and it was a very tough environment. And we also get that when we looked into Ada Lovelace and Mary Shelley. And in the case of Ada, you know, she, being Byron's daughter, she had a particularly tough regimen that was laid upon her where she had to stand still for 2 hours at a time. So there are a lot of very unusual things that come into play when we look at the Orphic Circle, but certainly it plays right into everything we're learning here about the Eighth Sphere and Steiner's work.
Larry Jackson wants to know, to get into that state, any chemicals/herbs to help them?
I have to say that my own investigation on this is different. It's not that they use drugs. As a matter of fact, it looks like the trance state was largely induced through suggestion. So they were using the original mesmerist suggestion technique, which was lost over time, and we got just a sliver of it in hypnosis. But of course, Mesmer used it for much larger things, including accessing different parts of the brain and, telepathy and all sorts of very fascinating things, healing. And now we have just this little sliver where when someone needs to remember something, they go into a hypnotic regression. That's about the only echo that we have left of the true mesmeric hypnotic state. But all the people working in the Orphic Circle were well-versed in mesmerism. And mesmerism becomes a key part of understanding the X steganography through time, because it was such a breakthrough and it was so public that the medical establishment there in France at the time had no idea how to handle it. And so some very funny stories about all these things they have to make up about Mesmer in order to get him out of there, because he is just, people are flocking to him because he has the key to this magnetism that is so healing. And people have just had it with that, the medical community in France. They're flocking to this guy. So the establishment just gets, basically gets rid of him. And but it takes him about 3 or 4 years to do it. It's quite an amazing story. But the things that Mesmer brought forward, we'll see those techniques which run deeply out of the mystery schools resurge and come back again.
How about one more question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so the UK Today wants to know, could DJ explain the X series in a sentence for newbies, as sometimes I get lost in it?
Well, I'm happy to. And of course, we're coming in here on episode 42, and you start to get some idea that maybe there's something, some pattern underneath the surface here, and that pattern is the X steganography. Now, the X steganography came up largely because in my work doing what I call dark journalism, which just goes beyond mainstream channels, I found that there were a number of programs, government programs, that would go secret and largely related to aerospace projects. And over again, I would see this pattern where the project would show up and then be well-funded and then disappear and go off the books. And then it would resurface with a new name, and the name always had this X steganography attached to it. So if we go through the series of projects like the X-15 and the X-20 dinosaur program associated with the Kennedy era, we can particularly see this X steganography bubbling up. So to the point where I got about 200 examples of this. But what was fascinating was, as I started to just kind of go through the X steganography into history, going back to see how far it went, it never stopped. And I kept going, and I found myself hanging out with the Egyptians in the Book of the Dead and the mystery schools, and finally in ancient Atlantis, about as far back as you can go in human history. And as a result of that, I started to realize that X steganography had been kept by the mystery schools. And the mystery school tradition coming out of Egypt and eventually Pythagoras, the Greeks, and going through the Hermetic stages in the Middle Ages, we started to see this resurgence of Rosicrucian activity around the 14th century, and then we start to go deeper and deeper into New Atlantis and Shakespeare and all these types of references. So the X steganography is something that showed up, and the steganography is it's a symbol that's used to let initiates know among themselves what's happening, basically. So one of the interesting documents I found that coined steganography was this, and it's a book actually from the Middle Ages called The Sure Art of Disclosing the Intention of One's Mind to Those Who Are Not Absent, through secret writing. The most reverend famous man, Johannes Trithemius, the abbot of Sponheim. This very interesting book gave me the key to why they were using the X, because what they were doing was using this steganography code. Now, steganography is different from regular cryptology, where you're cracking a code and there's an ancient secret associated with it, or in a government program you set up a series of reverting passwords. In this case, steganography is always there staring you in the face, and you don't know that it's there. It's only the people who are operating those things that understand all of the different things that are associated with the imagery. So I started to see that X over and over again, and I think the X in general is a very powerful symbol all the way through St. Andrew's Cross. And I had used it as the Dark Journalist logo long before I was deeply engaged in the X Steganography. So it's just one of those subconscious things that happened. But I think that in a nutshell, then, the X Steganography helps us to decipher this hidden pattern of basically concealing relevant facts about a particular type of effect. And the effect I've called Apotheum. And Apotheum is this effect that in the 20th and 21st century is something we know very well through the UFO file. And we hear so much about government secrecy associated with UFOs and all this. Very often the thing that they're trying to hide is not just that there are all these disks floating around everywhere and they might be alien in nature, but that the effects that they create when they show up completely subvert the physics that we know in the known universal physical world. So, we get into a very interesting situation when time stops, and you have time gaps missing, and, you have crop circles and plants don't grow, and all of these different things that would happen. A town is blacked out, or a transformer gets blown. These are the types of things that we see over and over again in relation to the UFO file. So that effect is something, a major kind of runaway physics. And so Apotheum is a term back there for the Greeks, and it gives us some idea of how they used it, but it's about this kind of effect, and it was the best word I could come up with to match what I was finding. And but if you go back into history, it's the Apotheum that the mystery schools are hiding too. Just like we're hiding government programs and the advanced X technology in the 20th and 21st centuries. If you go back to the Chaldeans and the Babylonians, they're using the X Steganography. And it's because those groups are sworn to secrecy over something that occurred using a high technology in ancient Atlantis. So in a nutshell, it is a system, really, the steganography, for letting initiates know and letting initiates track certain things. But the symbols and sources have to be there in the public. And the best way to think about it, and I think I have a picture of this, is that it's really, the discovery here of the X Steganography is very much like the Rosetta Stone. Because, of course, with hieroglyphs, we had no idea what they meant at all in relation to, a language, and no one had any clue. And it was only in 1799 that we deciphered through the Rosetta Stone the code of the hieroglyphs. Otherwise, the pyramids and the Sphinx and everything else are just a bunch of pretty pictures, big buildings with pretty pictures on them. We wouldn't have understood anything about Egyptian culture or history without that breakthrough. Now, it was Napoleon who found it with his forces, and the only reason that we got to know what they were is because there's a proclamation here set down in 3 different languages, including the Old Coptic from Egyptian. And as it turns out, the hieroglyphs were one of the ones that they used. So, of course, at that time, this was made. The Rosetta Stone was made about 100 BC, and right in that period, and all 3 languages were still in use. So that's how we got the breakthrough. So therefore, think of the X Steganography really as the Rosetta Stone. Now we can read things that we weren't able to before. And the amount of breakthroughs that we're finding in relationship to it are going to help us re-examine history completely. But what it really shows is the incredible activity of the mystery schools. I would say it's kind of like the fundamental version.
David Tormina wanted to kind of sum it up in one sentence, and I just want to check with you to see if he's got it right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
David Tormina.
The search for the meaning of hidden communications between secret societies and dark government projects.
Well, that's a good one. That's a pretty good one. I mean, it ignores the fact that you don't need one for the other. That's the only trick there. So I would say that what happens is the mystery school activity informs the deep state activity. So it shows that political relationship. So in that sense, it's absolutely right. But you can track, if you're a Mayan archaeologist and you're looking for links to ancient Atlantis in the mystery schools, then you can track with X Steganography what's happening there, and you can, extrapolate out that way without considering the political end of it at all. And what's interesting is that if you're in politics, you can use X Steganography without being interested at all in the archaeology or the mystery school aspect. So it's quite fascinating. But I think what the X Steganography reveals is that blending that relationship of the two. But these are good questions, because the X and the different phrases that we use in this program, I think if we understand them and use them, the more, we develop a new language around these things, and that becomes important. Another key aspect of the X series is stealth archives. And I want to bring this one up because stealth archives are this is one of the most fundamental tenets behind what we're trying to show here on the program. So stealth archives, for example, are things that we know about but can't get our hands on. So, for example, the Nixon time capsule that whistleblower Robert Merritt told us about, and which, some stories are finally coming out about now. Since we did the story last February 14th. But that story about the time capsule with an energy formula being buried there as a time capsule in the White House, coming from someone who was inside the Houston plan, is quite dramatic, much better than any kind of loosey-goosey whistleblower stuff that we see churned out in alternative media. But I would say that it gives us this glimpse into, just like there's a number of volumes that the Rockefellers put together for this Project for America, Prospects for America in the 1950s. And they let out all these volumes, but 4 of the volumes are kept secret and locked away there, and we can't get at them. So we know they're there, but we can't get our hands on them. So they're stealth archives. If you really go back and you look at the Edgar Cayce material, and when he's talking about the Hall of Records underneath the Sphinx, this gets very interesting, because we know about this, right? And we know that there are these Atlantean records out there, but we can't get our hands on them. So there's a number of things that are there, sitting there, that we just can't touch. So stealth archives, I think, really give us a classification of something that is coming forward but has not yet entered the public consciousness. But it's right there on the periphery. We're right there looking at it. So yeah, I think that gives us a pretty good X overview there, Miss Olivia. Mm-hmm. I would say.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
Okay, Najat wanted to ask, does anyone know for certain what, who, or where the origin of X is?
Well, it's very interesting.
I do. Health and Hygiene wanted to answer that question.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay. And the origin of the X is in fact Osiris, adopted by the Coptic who believed in Christ as God of as above, so below Hermes.
Yeah, well, I mean, they used it, yes. And you could say that the Greeks used it. X was actually a symbol for Christ. So when we get to, by the time you get to St. Andrew's Cross, they're also reflecting the X Steganography. The point is they all use it. This is the weird thing. Plato uses it in his famous Plato's Cross, which represents actually an astronomical event. And that gets us into the whole thing about the Greek mysteries and, all of the kind of deep ceremonies that they would get into, awaiting for this cross to happen in the sky. And you'll find that I've cited the work of George Latour, actually quite a fascinating historian who talks a lot about Plato's X. So we can see that this comes up. You might see that once in a while there's a program out there about the Templars, and they're always talking about this hooked X, which made its way over from France all the way to the Americas, but way before Columbus. So we can see that there's something up with the X imagery, even if you weren't looking at it as steganography. It's just all over the place. And, you're not finding, for example, in normal activity, you'll find a certain amount of spheres, you'll find a certain amount of X's, you'll find a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that. But over and over again, the X is the one that is used as the pattern. But you can still see that because it's steganography, someone could attribute it to just being like, well, this is experimental, or, whatever it happens to be. You can use it in any normal fashion. The trick is to try to look at it with an initiate's eye and understand why the steganography is there and what it is telling the people who understand. And there is a way, and there is a formula, we've employed it in our research, to kind of dismiss the stuff that doesn't fit. Largely, it has to be, steganography has a kind of a pattern that becomes obvious once you start to track it. And but these are great questions. What it shows too is what a great think tank we have right here in the ideas room, which is what I call the chat here, because the chat doesn't really sum up what we have. We have some great minds there, and we appreciate it. Of course, on Twitter, we have so many fascinating conversations going on there also. So I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on the X Steganography episode 42, and this one deals with the eighth sphere. Now, the eighth sphere is a concept that comes to us directly out of the theosophical, anthroposophical tradition, and how closely it relates to virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism. And the warnings are clear that the mystery schools are giving us in that period, the late 19th century and early 20th century. And we're going to get into them tonight. We're going to get into them through the figure of Rudolf Steiner, the leader of the Anthroposophical Society, who we've covered on this program a few times. But there's so much I could say about Steiner and his work. You know, what's funny, and what I tell people very often, is you've probably run across Steiner's work and not even known it, because Steiner is so prolific in so many different areas, from biodynamic farming. That's a complete Steiner anthroposophical spiritual science invention. The Waldorf schools, early education schools, of course, that's a major Steiner effort. Eurythmy, which is a kind of a spiritual form of theater and dance and movement. These are the things that he brought out, along with spiritual science and threefold social development. So he was a very prolific player in a number of different fields, but he was largely a scholar. And I think this is why in the esoteric tradition, he's one of the most powerful echoes there and gave us the best foundation, because very often you have these incredible figures like Edgar Cayce or Blavatsky, who really bring forward an astonishing revelation to humanity. But, you know, the intellectual prowess and genius of Steiner gave him the ability to kind of satisfy that end of the spectrum of explaining it in a scientific fashion or explaining it in an intellectual fashion, keeping in mind scholarly kind of precepts, along with the spiritual aspect. He's a great blending of spirituality and science. And so I think that he's a real breakthrough figure, as we see. Looking back on his history, he's also a man out of time. Steiner died in 1925, but easily his concepts, if you look at them, are so far ahead of time that I still think we're nowhere near catching up to what he put out there. And I say that about Edgar Cayce's work as well. What the Theosophical Society and Anthroposophy were laying out for us, they were giving us a snapshot here 100 years later into what was going to befall us, and they gave us keys in order to open this up. Now, I was talking about steganography, and before I get off that, I do want to mention that some of the more fascinating X's in things like the Central Intelligence Agency work, or in Army intelligence, or whatever it happens to be, they're very, very aware of the X steganography, and they use it quite often. I'm going to give you a very good example. This one, which ties in all of our themes for tonight, is always out front. Now, that might almost look like a logo for a New Age school. How about Army intelligence? How does that grab you? So in Army intelligence, we have the logo always out front, and they have a Sphinx facing off there into the distance. He's got a key crossing him, making an X with a lightning bolt. The lightning bolt is the Apotheum, of course, and the key is the X steganography that unlocks why the secrecy is held. And the Sphinx, what they're doing with the Sphinx, certainly is giving us an esoteric snapshot of what they're up to. But we see this over and over again. They communicate with each other using this kind of language. So instead of getting us, you know, sort of running down, as you see very often, people run down number schemes, you know, like take the numbers backwards and add up the numbers in numerology and see what they mean. A lot of those things are too much work. The X is a lot easier to follow, actually, as it turns out. So, but one of the things I want to point out is over and over again, we see that it's not only embedded in modern, secrecy programs, and it's not just embedded in the ancient past. We find it all throughout. It's just embedded in everything that we know. For example, Thomas Jefferson, when he put together so much of the work around the American Constitution, there are so many X's involved in that early history. But one of them is he was trying to set up something called the Great Seal of the state of Jefferson, which was going to be like a Pacific Republic, was there one of the names for it. And this is the Great Seal here with the X's again. And, we're going to find this over and over that it's used, and these groups understand it, whether, they could be coming out of Masonry, or they could be coming out of secret societies, or direct from the mystery schools. Because again, one of the things I want to point out when we speak about mystery schools, and I've tried to really point out on this program, is that there are levels to these mystery schools. And so that, I had someone write to me, I always use it as a great example, saying, well, I think I was in a mystery school, and, we studied these things. It doesn't work that way, because if you were in a mystery school, you'd know it, because it's completely life transforming. There's a number of oaths you need to keep. And the people that you would interact with would, you would certainly know it. Now, there are a degree of levels. For example, there's something just called lesser schools, which are a step below the mystery schools. And it's not such a lofty title, because they know almost everything that the mystery schools know, but they're not in that upper realm. So the lesser schools are there. The arcane schools also exist under there. The arcane schools are, they kind of have things by rote, in a sense. That is, they keep the secrecy, they learn the traditions, but they're not as expansive as the main mystery schools or the lesser schools. But they're an incredible bank of knowledge in the arcane schools. And then the schools beneath that, you have private study groups, which you can get some advanced figures who will operate in those. And then below that are public study groups, which, I think many of us here probably tonight have been in one form or another. So it's all relating to mystery school work, yes, but you have to understand, if you want to talk about a real mystery school, I think you'd be talking about figures like Steiner, like Gurdjieff, like some of these very powerful voices that came public for us there in the 20th century. I think I might have shown this last time, but the X Steganography there behind Bezos going to space, there's all sorts of imaging about this X that you'll find the deeper and deeper we go. In modern, in the modern version of the mystery schools, say in the last 150 years, they brought the X out directly through the Theosophical Society. It was actually embedded in their logo initially. And they did X ceremonies there. One of the X ceremonies, this is very important, as a foundational piece, which is this being Annie Besant, who became the leader of the Theosophical Society after Annie Helena Blavatsky passed away. She passed the leadership over to her. And of course, this is Colonel Olcott, who started the Theosophical Society with Helena Blavatsky. And Annie Besant is somebody I point out very often is not just some lofty spiritual personality writing the 40 keys to spiritual living. This is somebody who worked with Gandhi to get him to establish home rule in India. This is somebody who established workers' rights in London, who got the suffragette movement going, women's rights. I mean, these are very active people on the political scene. And I think that interface there between the two of them has to be understood, which is they take that spiritual knowledge and they have that attunement, and then they fulfill that attunement with service. And that has to be the major key when you look at any of these types of activities, because very often the promise of some mystery schools of the left-hand way, I would say the kind of Crowleyan way, is that you're going to learn all these things, but they're not really encouraging you to do any service with it. Well, it just so happens that deep in the mystery school tradition is that the attunement is only one half of it. That's only one half of the program. And if you don't learn the other half, you're imbalanced. So I always point out that the Casey Foundation, in his original Search for God groups, they were looking for all these fantastic exercises to do. And, they said, what can we do to put us in that kind of mood, that attunement state? What types of things can we do? And the task that he gave them was to push elderly people in wheelchairs along Virginia Beach. So you get some idea that there's a service component that is active if you want to learn these things. And that's what starts to open up those higher centers and acts as a good kind of check on the egoistic properties involved with learning such amazing techniques. Now, we're going to talk about Steiner tonight. And one of the reasons that we're going so deep on the eighth sphere tonight is because the eighth sphere was misidentified in occult literature as the moon. And we know that this Chinese rover just landed on the moon, and it's actually landed on the far side of the moon for the first time. This is quite remarkable. And we're looking at the situation where the Chinese, the Indians, of course, the Russians have a very advanced space program. And when we go into these areas and we see that, America created this abundant space program. I have a chart here somewhere. I think I showed this on Tuesday, talking about the moon race. But as you can see, right after the 1970s, we have nothing. And now there's a little activity about going to the moon. Big deal. It's 50 years ago. So what happened? One of the main NASA engineers actually said that we no longer have the technology to go to the moon. It's very strange. So obviously the whole program went black, and now these other countries have gotten up to a point where they can challenge us, and we're going to have to cough it up, because they're going to talk about the things that they find, not initially perhaps because they're under certain types of international agreements. But if the Chinese go up there and find structures and ruins and things like that on the moon, they could use that as a very big bargaining chip if we want to keep it quiet. So there's really big, kind of things going on that are much better than the kind of disclosure stuff that you hear about. And, won't the government please confirm this document from 1948 is real? That's not real disclosure. But international space stations doing their own programs after we've turned the entire space program into a secret space program, that's valuable. That means you're going to get some real answers, and that's what they're gearing up for.
Fuberfight wanted to know, why did the Chinese land on the dark side? I'd like to know that too.
I think it's just part of their scientific mission. I mean, they might also have a hidden reason, but I think the official reason was just that it was something that was not explored. So, we've had manned space missions to the moon, and we've also sent up these kind of automatic robot type things, but a real probe on the dark side of the moon is something completely unusual. So it is interesting, though. I am right there with your interest as well. It's quite unusual. And I think this is what we're going to continue to see. And India's next. And watch India, because they're very, very ambitious about it. These are some of the tracks that the Chinese rover made. Very interesting. I think this is the kind of story that is going to shake some things up, because these people are very committed. Now, the question is, when we look at the moon and these types of programs, why would I take our attention back to the mystery schools? What would be the reason, for example, to explore the work of Helena Blavatsky in relation to the moon? This is a pretty reasonable question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it here. These people coming out of the mystery schools, long before our space program, were very aware of what was happening out there. And this is where the eighth sphere comes in. So they understood this information in ancient times, cosmologically. And we've heard a lot of echoes about this, and it's been kind of over-dramatized by things like, the Sitchin work on Anunnaki, and, the Sumerians had this cosmology. But the fact is, aside from all the hyperbole about it, the Mayans and the Egyptians and the Chaldeans and the Sumerians had advanced astronomy, and there's no good explanation for it. because they didn't have the type of instruments like telescopes that would allow them to do that. So how do you get them knowing these things that well? They had a tradition back there that goes back to Atlantis, where they would appoint people into these situations as priestesses and priests of that particular realm, astronomy, or priests and priestesses, as we'll find out tonight, of particular planets. And so that they would merge into a kind of etheric state to get information and then bring that information back. And you could track it just like you would have good physical information side by side. So they understood these things. Now, the Atlanteans also had the technology to survey the whole planet, as we found in things like the Piraeus map. The ancients had that knowledge. And if you go back into it, there's no reason to fight with historians about it, because if you go back, Plato is telling you that, Pythagoras is telling you that, the Atlanteans had the technology. They were the ones. And the legacy cultures that came afterwards, like the Egyptians and like the Babylonians, they inherited a great tradition. So that's the way that we need to look at this. This is how they had this information. But those mystery schools inherited it from those early cultures that had the great mystics and the great technology to do this. So they knew and they understood these things, even though the broad culture was totally ignorant in terms of what was happening. And so when we got into it and we start having things and people like Kepler and Newton and all the rest of it, we're starting to get somewhere. But the mystery schools always had the knowledge and the activity. They never lost it. It was only the public that lost it. So Blavatsky, when she comes out in 1875 with the Theosophical Society, and then writes Isis Unveiled, and in quick succession 2 volumes of The Secret Doctrine, she lets out information that has been buried in the mystery schools for thousands of years. Some of that information is still not widely understood, 1. 2, that information we take for granted now, and we think, this was always known, or whatever it happens to be, but it actually came right out of her work with The Secret Doctrine. We wouldn't have the information otherwise. Also later with Theosophy and Anthroposophy. So this is something I think that we need to keep in mind as we go through this. So one of the concepts that came up in the Theosophical Society through the work of Blavatsky was that these masters of wisdom were initiates, and that they held this information, and that the information came all the way back from these lost cultures, and that they had basically achieved a state where they could exist in an etheric body and help humanity. They were advanced physical, spiritual beings helping us here physically. So this kind of masters of wisdom tradition is embedded deep in the Theosophical tomes. Now, what happens is, in the mystery schools, there's a series of mystery schools, and most of them have some kind of public interface, like Theosophy, for example. So you have this kind of esoteric layer inside, and then you have the exoteric on the outside. But the exoteric aspect is quite important, because when you get to that exoteric layer, then you can get distortions. And so you get what they call brotherhoods of the left. So when you get those two going at the same time, they can confuse the public. And what happened, according to Rudolf Steiner, this is something I brought up anytime we get into the history of the mystery schools, and it has to be a kind of a fundamental understanding, is that around 1840, these schools decided, with the advent of scientific materialism and what we would come to know as Ahrimanic forces coming in to kind of dumb down this and kind of dim down this consciousness in humanity and really bring us into a backwards state. So we would have, the scientific conception, and the more we would get into the brilliance of the intellectual scientific conception of scientific materialism, which, by the way, is really a small kind of scientific thinking, and it's the dominant kind, but it's the kind that literally boils everything down to results-based testing, that the only thing that's real is what can be measured. And in such a rigid fashion, and in such a kind of a hierarchical fashion, that I think we're looking at something that the mystery schools viewed as very destructive to humanity's understanding of their own spirituality. So a major split takes place there in the mystery schools. And this is mirrored all through, it's fascinating how many different places this battle shows up. But one of the key places it shows up is in a book by C.G. Harrison called The Transcendental Universe, there around 1893, I believe. And this war of the mystery schools that takes place in that period is quite dramatic, because we see all these strange things that happen, like spiritualism takes off in the 19th century. And we see these groups springing up everywhere, like Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Golden Dawn. And this is all in reaction to the fact that this thing is coming down to basically transform humanity into something that, you know, you won't recognize as humanity in 100 years. And we're inheriting that now with the transhumanism, which is going to kind of pull a lot of this together. But I think it's important for us when we look at this and take Steiner's version of what he's saying, that in the 1840s this happened, and that the mystery schools had to make a decision to bring information out, and that the process of doing that was very clumsy because there was a lot of push-pull going out. So it was a messy process. It wasn't like they had decided on high to give us this great gift. It was that, oh, you know, here it is. We have to do it faster than we realized. How do we get it out there without causing more damage? And also, they are bound through ages and, you know, eons, just complete centuries and millennia of secrecy. So how do you bring this stuff out all of a sudden? But they found a way. They decided at a certain point to bring it out through a compromise figure, which was Helena Blavatsky, in that she was advanced enough and had the old kind of mediumistic tendencies. So she was a great master. But she also had the ability, the steadfast ability to stand up to this kind of religious and media persecution that would take place when she brought these facts out. That was kind of a crucial aspect. So Blavatsky, as Steiner would point out, started Theosophy, and that at Theosophy's core stood true initiators. That's the way he put it. And we have to keep that in mind, that very often when they go through histories of Blavatsky, they like to talk about this kind of cigarette-smoking, tough woman who used rough
Was it cigarettes
language.
or cigars?
No, as far as I understand, she rolled her own cigarettes. Okay. Cigars would probably make more sense, but... Mm-hmm. But her development of the Theosophical Society brought some truly major figures out. And one of the figures that we get through that was this fellow named A.P. Sinnett. And Sinnett was actually a banker. And he was very interested in esoteric material. And he started, through his ability and relationship with Blavatsky, to interface with these masters of higher knowledge. One of the things that happened in that process was that he started to talk in a book called Esoteric Buddhism about the eighth sphere. Now, according to Steiner, this was not something that the mystery schools were supposed to have done, at least not at that point. It was their biggest secret. And what it represents, what the idea basically is that in our imagination, we are subject to forces that can pull us into another realm. And that those forces are active in such a way that what they're trying to do is, in the normal course of soul evolution, we go through a series of incarnations, and those incarnations actually happen through the planetary steps. And that they had kind of created an artificial step in order to drag these different souls into. So this is a very heavy cosmology through Theosophy and Anthroposophy that we're going to have to try to make some sense out of. But I want to go to a few quotes from Steiner himself on this, because I think we're going to get a kind of a nice picture of what he was saying. There's a picture of Rudolf Steiner who, you know, was in Anthroposophy for many years. He was actually the most popular trainer, speaker, and lecturer in the Theosophical circuit in Germany. And he had a number of followers for Theosophy long before he quit to start Anthroposophy. And I don't think he would have if they hadn't developed such a heavy relationship with C.W. Ledbetter, and Ledbetter, who really wanted to push this Krishnamurti world teacher idea. And, we've talked about theosophy and the history there, so I won't go too deep into that, but I will say that I think one of the things that happened is that really what you're looking at there is in anthroposophy versus theosophy. Theosophy wanted the Eastern initiators. They wanted the Eastern answers, and that Steiner felt that the Eastern initiators had set it up now for the Western initiators to come forward, and that we couldn't just go round and round in circles and have the East take the lead again. And this was the setup where Theosophy was really thinking, no, we need the masters of wisdom. We need the Eastern masters. We need that whole system again that saved us before, the Buddhism. And this esoteric Buddhism, and that basically, fundamentally, Steiner was saying we need this Western tradition to come forward. That's where the future lies, and we need to kind of come through the door, even if we have a religious system that persecutes the esoteric aspect. We need to move forward with this. So this is kind of the battle of his era, and we have to keep Steiner in mind as somebody who came through that battle and gave us these gifts and made some very interesting predictions about the period that we're in right now, which I'm going to go to. And you might even find a lot of close references there to the World Wide Web, as a matter of fact. I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here on episode 42. You bet we're going to get into the singularity and AI and how it relates to this eighth sphere concept. So again, we're going to do that wild swing from modern 21st century times right there into the heart of about 1888, 1889. And it's interesting how they ring when you go back and forth. You can hear that little echo. But before I do that, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Good. Nell wanted to know, where did Steiner get his insights? And then there was another question about Steiner's background. And of course, he wasn't Jewish, he was Catholic.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
But have we really covered Steiner?
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
You and I were just listening to a lecture about this. And he didn't become a mystic until after 40, right?
Well, it's not actually true.
Okay.
And it is, what it is.
But did he have an awakening at some point where it really?
Yeah, at 12 years old.
Oh.
Yeah. See, the thing is that what he said is that in the mystery school tradition, until you're 40, you can't teach after a mystery tradition. They make it so that you are built, basically. And it's usually a 20-year development period, so that by the time you're 40, you can teach the deep truths of the mystery traditions. But it's a steadfast rule, according to Steiner, that you do that. So in that sense, yes, but Steiner was already such a mystic, it sort of didn't matter. He was out there doing it. And I think very often that people have mixed that up to say, well, he didn't do it till he was 40. But no, it's just that he said that that's the traditional rule. It just so happened with him that when he was very young, there was a master who was a gardener and who kind of kept an eye on him. And he was known in that district where Steiner grew up as just this kind of fascinating gardener that knew everything about plants. But it turned out that he was kind of a representative of this tradition, and he eventually revealed to Steiner that these mystery schools had been watching him and wanted to initiate him, and he introduced Steiner to that mystery tradition and a master who initiated Steiner into the mysteries. But I don't think that see, the interesting thing about Steiner is he never made a big deal about that. He had to go on record with it, but he never rested his authority in the fact that the mystery schools had chosen him to do this. He always rested it in his personal scholarship. So it is quite fascinating. And how Steiner got around to it, he had a number of mystical experiences as a child, and he was naturally psychic, and he was not a very good student at first, which is funny because he became an incredible scholar later. But he was somebody who was gifted in mathematics, and as soon as he discovered geometry, everything else opened up for him. But along with that opening up, he had a number of experiences that were like, he would see dead relatives, for example, and he would predict events and things of this nature, so that this overshadowing of his spiritual work was coming into focus. And he also was starting to realize in his 20s that he could actually see into people's past lives, that is, just by being with them. And he meets a major figure of the time, a poet, and he sees his past life. One of the interesting things about him also, it's not widely known, is that early in his life, he was chosen to be someone who would bring out Nietzsche's work, which is really quite fascinating because Nietzsche saw the world in a completely different vein. But I think it helped Steiner to get some kind of grounding by looking at the other end of the spectrum. But he largely came to prominence through being a scholar of Goethe's work, and he put out a number of books about Goethe. And Goethe was kind of the flowering of the German Renaissance and poetry and science. So Steiner was kind of writing an appreciation of him 100 years after the fact. We know Goethe shows up in so many weird places, including in the story of Nikola Tesla, who, when he was reading his poetry, got inspired to give us alternating current. Well, that's where we get these lights, and that's how we're transmitting this internet to you tonight. So thank you, Goethe, and thank you, Nikola. But yeah, certainly we've done 3 or 4 shows directly on Steiner, and we have more biographical information there. So let's do this now. Let's get a couple of quotes going from Steiner. And I always say, actually, I have a couple of good pictures of Steiner here. But I always say, when it comes to mystics, it's always in the eyes. You can't miss it. And Steiner, of course, incredibly mystical eyes. And, that's not somebody who's looking to kind of put on a mask. He is somebody who's trying to get the word out. This is a very casual shot of Steiner that I like very much, because you can almost picture him.
He looks like Joseph Farrell there.
Yeah, he sort of does. He sort of does.
Yeah, similar expression.
It's that's his kind of Silicon Valley look, I think. This is the weird thing about Steiner. You look at him sometimes and you're like, oh yeah, he's a guy in the 19th century or whatever. But sometimes you look at him and you're like, wow, it looks like he's right from now. It's fascinating. And this is a fundamental portrait of him with Annie Besant, and it's a crucial picture because although they eventually split, keep this in mind, he worked for her for 9 years. So largely anthroposophy comes out of that theosophical tradition. And who did Annie Besant work directly under? Helena Blavatsky. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of the lineage. It's Blavatsky to Besant, and then Steiner breaks away. So Steiner gets the benefits of understanding the theosophical tradition, understanding the higher knowledge, but he moves his own version of it. He moves his own way when he sees theosophy has gone wrong and is trying to elect these, this whole kind of world teacher idea. One of the main things that Steiner brought forward is information about the Ahrimanic forces. This was his own personal sculpture of Ahriman, this is basically the devil character in anthroposophy. And Ahriman is very interesting because Steiner felt that he is particularly a modern dark astral force, because what's happening there is he's embodying technology and progress. And the whole point is that Ahriman's lower astral group, is moving humanity into this 8th sphere. And it might have sounded like a strange fantasy when Steiner brought it up, but by the time you get into the virtual reality and people sucked into their phones, they're already swimming in that 8th sphere. They're getting pretty close. So to get at some hint of that anthroposophical cosmology, I think is quite fascinating. Okay, some quotes directly from Rudolf Steiner. I'll remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep in the X sphere tonight with Rudolf Steiner's work from Anthroposophy and Spiritual Science. And you can ask your questions in the second half of the program. We've taken some already, but we're going to have a QA section on this. So ask those questions for Olivia. And Olivia, I'm going into this now. Do you have something?
Nope, we're good for now.
Good. Okay. Okay, Steiner, giving us some hint of what's happening. Quote, I repeat then, and this is from a series of interviews, Picture of Earth Evolution in the Future. Very important lectures that were given in 1921. And this is, Steiner, having gone through World War I, is very, very disappointed with the way that progress has happened. And he's also looking at theosophy and anthroposophy as failures, and he predicts that in 100 years from this period, that is 1921, we're going to get another opportunity to have the mystery schools come forward. We're right in that window as we speak. Okay, quote, I repeat then that since the last third of the 19th century, spiritual beings from the cosmos have been coming into our own sphere of existence. Their home is the sphere lying between the moon and Mercury. This is very important. But they're already pressing forward into the realm of Earth existence and seeking to gain a foothold there. Moving down. We're speaking of concrete fact when we say spiritual beings are seeking to come down into Earth existence and ought to willingly be received. Catastrophe after catastrophe must ensue, and earthly life will fall at length into social chaos. Sound familiar? And it's very interesting, actually, the way he puts this. And earthly life will fall at length into social chaos if opposition is maintained in human existence to the advent of these beings. So there's something happening where there's a wave of spiritual understanding hitting the earth, and there's a kind of gross materialism setting in since the 1840s of this kind of concrete materialistic version of reality. And what he's saying is the catastrophes get worse the more that clash is taking place if we're not opening up and being receptive to these forces that are coming in. So he goes deep here into talking about the different types of beings. I'm going to save that. What I want to do, actually, is talk about how this, the eighth sphere aspect plays into this. Now let's look at this. It's very difficult indeed to speak about the so-called eighth sphere. This is Steiner again, direct quote, which was referred to openly for the first time by A.P. Sinnott. One cannot say that he gave information about it, for what he said was a fallacy. You can certainly realize why it's difficult to speak about this subject, for again, it must be emphasized that our language has been coined for the outer material world, and the eighth sphere was regarded as a secret matter until it was mentioned by Sinnott. So Sinnott really let the cat out of the bag, and I find that interesting. It may have been by design. Again, that is A.P. Sinnott. And he was the banker who worked very closely and had a genuine interest in the subject, but apparently was manipulated with some false esoteric activity. This is Steiner's version of the eighth sphere. The eighth sphere is the red section, the blue is the Earth, and that larger section is the moon. So somehow in that orbit, from that view, this is how the eighth sphere is developing. But I don't want us to think that the eighth sphere is a planet. The eighth sphere is a realm, and this is where spiritual science is kind of giving us. But I'm going to get to Steiner's description of this. Quote, consequently, there are not many words that can be used for characterizing the eighth sphere. The fact that all mention was avoided for so long will also enable you to realize what is involved when one speaks of it. You'll therefore have to take the aphoristic remarks I shall make today as a kind of introductory exposition, given with the object of throwing out certain indications, which to begin with can only be a small contribution to the subject. Think about that. He's saying, I can just give you a little bit about what it is, even though it's out there in the public. I shall try to characterize what is called the eighth sphere in order that we may have a foundation for describing the development of the spiritual movement in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. You'll have realized from the lecture yesterday that the eighth sphere cannot be anything that belongs to the material world. It's very important. For I've shown you that the greatest fallacy of Sinnott's statement is that the physical moon is directly connected with the eighth sphere, and I try to make it comprehensible that the actual foundation of the error consists in the fact that this pointed to something material and physical. So this is very interesting because Sinnott basically said, well, the eighth sphere and all these traditions and the mystery traditions is the moon. That's what they're talking about. But the moon is a physical object, and the eighth sphere is in creation. And it's very interesting because when Steiner is talking about spheres, just like when he talks about Vulcan, Vulcan is something that's in development, which is where the life wave and humanity's development is supposed to take it. That is, we move from the Earth evolution through to this Jupiter wave. And this is this Vulcan, this new Jupiter that's being developed. Now, what's fascinating about that is the interruption of that step in the Steiner cosmology is caused by Ahriman and these Ahrimanic forces. And the reason is, as lower astral beings, part of creation, at a certain point, they completely dominated humanity. And they like that domination. And at this point, they have to keep reintroducing themselves and kind of refooling humanity. But what they've done is they've done that kind of all that glitters is gold thing, which is that you don't have any spirituality. All you need is kind of the riches of the earth, and we'll, kind of keep you in this scientific religion that you are the greatest thing, and that, the more that you learn, the more you can become a god. Now, when we talk about the singularity and we get into figures like Ray Kurzweil and the leading transhumanist figures, this is what they're talking about. This is where they're going. This is where they're taking us with them. This is why you're seeing the robot revolution. This is why you're seeing the idea that people should be chipped and all the rest of it, because they think that their kind of, their version of the global control grid makes them God. And therefore, they're electing themselves into that position. But we in society, seeing this wave happen, and some of the responsible members of society calling it out, this is the great battle that's taking place. And let me tell you, at the beginning of 2019, the battle is really obvious, like more obvious than it ever has been. The mystery schools came forward in this period, starting in 1875, with the Theosophical Society, moving this information through us all the way to 1925 with the death of Rudolf Steiner. And that's a 50-year period. Later, they came forward with the work of Edgar Cayce and all the rest of it. They've been there. They've been active. And we've gotten some offshoots of their work through the Gurdjieff work and all the rest of it. But that mystery tradition over and over again shows up, and it's giving us that real hint of where things are moving. Now, Steiner is trying to give us an idea of what the eighth sphere is, and then he's telling us what will happen if we're not aware of this. So, although Sinnott got it out early, it needed to come out because we needed to find out what it was all about. So let's go back to the quotes now. There are a couple of visual representations that I get for this. While I'm doing that, Olivia, why don't you?
I have a great question from JJK.
Okay.
How spiritual are you, DJ, or does logic take precedence over your work?
Oh, a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you think, Olivia?
I think you try to be very balanced.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's a good answer. I like your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that, it's interesting with me because remember, I'm a reporter, so I'm a journalist on this stuff. So it's a little bit different than the role of somebody who would be a spiritual teacher or something along that nature. What I'm trying to do is dig out the relevant facts that they gave us and give us some reflection of the world that the mystery schools are trying to give out to us. But it's a great question. And I would say that hopefully, what you hope for when you're doing this kind of work is that you are being spiritual to a certain degree.
Well, it's a balance between intuition, right? Your right side of the brain, and your intellect on the left. Right?
If you want spiritual, you want to talk to Olivia. That's the spiritual one in the room. Watch out.
Speaking of, actually,
yeah.
I do want to ask you this. So DT Bielo wanted to know, has Gigi Young received any impressions regarding Steiner or the eighth sphere?
Gigi Young has all kinds of impressions about Steiner and the eighth. Gigi Young is out there,
yes,
and it's great to have Gigi out there. One of the programs actually I was watching recently was Gigi Young on the Pleiadians, and that is a fascinating little video she put together on that. All of her information, of course, is remarkable, and for sure, in the videos and the shows that she's done with me here on the X series, she's put a lot together out of the Steiner work and more. So she continues to do that, and we certainly hope to have her back to do some more.
Gigi just answered the question. I certainly have.
There's no question about that. But I will say this, that, it's amazing working with Gigi because it's like everything goes quantum, things start coming out of nowhere, and you have to know that Chi-Chi's one of the best when it comes to the esoteric subject. You're not going to find anyone better.
Okay, on that note, though, Titan Blood wanted to know, are there any other interpretations of the eighth sphere from masters like Blavatsky or Casey?
Yeah, absolutely. Blavatsky certainly discusses it because it came up in relation to Sinnett, and it's very interesting because she took the opportunity to not correct the record where Steiner decided to do it. And I think what she was thinking, perhaps, was that is a secret and that she shouldn't correct it and get it out there. But Steiner is absolutely beside himself with the fact that we're moving into this idea on the esoteric side that the moon is the eighth sphere, and it was totally wrong. And, people get confused about this because there are, in that period of time, we didn't know Pluto was there. So they knew about the planets that they had up to that point. But the eighth sphere actually doesn't even represent that, because in the esoteric tradition, the spheres, the sun and the earth are included in that. And one of the eight spheres in the anthroposophical system is Vulcan, which is not yet a planet, but it is a sphere. So the sphere idea, so we're not talking about an eighth planet. I guess I want to make that clear. Even though we're including planets, the sphere aspect seems to be the idea of a realm that develops and sometimes is physical, like the Earth is physical, and the eighth sphere is around the Earth. But there's a problem with the eighth sphere in that it's an artificial development from these lower astral beings, and that the harmonic forces in developing the eighth sphere are using our normal evolutionary wave and diverting it into this kind of fantasy imaginary realm where they control things and where they basically harvest humanity. So this is the great challenge, according to the anthroposophical tradition, to see the harmonic forces for what they are and to wake up and not get sucked into the eighth sphere, because literally the upshot of the eighth sphere is you go round and around without ever progressing in that eighth sphere. So, we're going to get deeper into what it is. I'm going to pull a couple of quotes here about the eighth sphere. And again, we're speaking in Steiner's cosmology. So just to give you some idea. During the Venus stage of evolution, a special cosmic body splits off that contains all the beings that have resisted evolution. A, so to speak, irredeemable moon. This is something that's going to happen in the future. This is part of the Steiner prediction. This irredeemable moon now moves toward an evolution for the character of which no expression can be found because it is too dissimilar to anything that man may experience on Earth. The evolved mankind, however, advances in a completely spiritualized existence to the Vulcan evolution stage of evolution, the description of which does not lie within the scope of this book. That's in the Outline of Occult Science, which is Steiner's masterpiece, really. But what he's saying is that there's a split, that what happens is in this setup with the eighth sphere, that these beings developing out of it, getting trapped in the eighth sphere, won't move to that normal progression. So that there's a normal progression, and it involves reincarnation, and it involves evolving through these planetary sources, and then the evolution spiritually is to this Vulcan state, which becomes maybe a quasi half-physical, half-etheric state. That's my interpretation based on what he's saying. I'm going to give you a few more quotes about the eighth sphere in history here that I think are important. Of the 7 oracles, this is Steiner again, Principle of Spiritual Economy lectures. Of the 7 oracles which were named after the 7 planets in ancient Atlantis, the Sun oracle stood out from all the others. But next to it, the Vulcan oracle prepared itself in secrecy for its future task. We have to understand this. In the anthroposophical Steiner work, we're moving into the Vulcan evolution. That's where things are going. The diversion is this weird eighth sphere harmonic forces, and this is the battle that's taking place. So when we have all these battles in these religious traditions, like Armageddon and all these things like that, what they're actually getting to the root of is the force and the sway of these harmonic forces trapping humanity and humanity's consciousness into a scientific materialism. And when they are in that scientific materialism, they are vulnerable to lose sight of their spiritual faculties. This great clash For people who keep those faculties, they move on and develop normally. And according to Steiner, those who get trapped in the eighth sphere eventually become irredeemable. So it's quite an interesting battle in the cosmology when you look at it that way. I'm going to pull a few more quotes to kind of give us an idea of this. And these are kind of the more advanced ones. Here is one picture of the eighth sphere. Now, this is interesting. The eighth sphere starts over here with Saturn, which was in an early evolutionary stage of humanity, and moves down. And this is the Earth evolution. But you can see this here, that's right next to the Earth evolution, is this artificial step called the eighth sphere. Where we're going is here, according to Steiner. That's the Vulcan goal of where this is going. But we're not going to go anywhere with that thing there. So, in essence, a kind of a shorthand about it is this figure of Ahriman is moving us to get trapped through the scientific materialistic forces, through the AI, through the transhumanism, into this artificial realm. And from there, humanity is harvested. Now, this is very important when you think about it, because as we roll into all of these advances, we don't have any defense against what's happening. That is, when we take on the technology, when we take on the advancements, these are natural advancements on one level that are supposed to happen. But we need to take them on from a certain point of view, that they can't become the kind of soul-destroying aspects that they are. And so anthroposophy is a bulwark against that movement. It is a gate. It's the ability to push back, as it were. Because it gives us an idea of what we're really talking about. In the modern era, we'd be looking at what we got with the Terminator. I mean, the Terminator basically story is that they built technology to such a point that the machines took over.
This is the thing.
This is it.
That terrifies me.
Well, because
it is not hard to see that we are, and RoboCop.
It was so easily predicted. That's 1984, right? Is that the first movie, 84?
I think so.
Yeah, it is. Okay. And then what did they call the group that headed it up? It was Skynet, right?
Oh, you mean Terminator?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Skynet controlled, and then eventually it got smart, and then it set off its own nuclear explosions, and it took over for humanity. Well, we're so close to that now that when they predicted it in the movie and you see these things happening, you're thinking to yourself, can't you just think of the movie? And it's also interesting to think about what inspired that movie. That movie was quite the zeitgeist of its time. So they really, I'd say, got very, very close with those. And of course, the quality of those movies got worse over time, but what can you do?
No, but it's challenging us all to become like Sarah Connor. That is the truth.
Hey, you're doing a better job every day on it. Here's a sketch directly from Steiner for how he wanted to present this in a lecture. Let's see if I can get a shot of that. Okay, that's the eighth sphere. Here's the Earth, there's the moon. So it's like the eighth sphere is right around the two and developing the two. It envelops the two. So now we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what it is. And he gets into some heavy, this is kind of like good versus evil stuff. So you have to be ready for that. You have now indications by means of which some approach can be made in thought to a conception of the eighth sphere, that it's not a physical object. I have said that the eighth sphere has something to do with residue left from the old moon during the early periods of evolution. So much you can gather from the studies we have pursued in the course of time. I tried to make clear in the lecture yesterday that on the old moon, that is the early version of the moon, man's natural mode of perception was visionary and imaginative in character. So that any mode of perception, so that any substantiality to be discerned in the eighth sphere must be found with this kind of vision. That is to say, it must be presumed at the outset that the eighth sphere is found by the way of visionary imagination. So we can see it. The mystery schools can see it because they have that clairvoyant ability, visionary imagination. How was it that the expression eighth sphere came to be used? You know that human evolution takes its course through the seven spheres of Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan. And remember, Vulcan is the sphere that is not a planet. We will conceive that besides these 7 spheres, there is still something else which lies outside of them, yet it is in some way related to the Earth. Here then we have a sphere visible only to visionary imaginative clairvoyance, which stands there as an 8th sphere over and above the 7 which constitute the domain of the ordered regular evolution of mankind. So he's giving us this indication that this is what the mystery schools had, is these 7 spheres. They excluded some planets, and there's a reason for that. But the 8th sphere is this artificial step being created by these lower astral forces. Okay. Well, you'll certainly have realized from our studies that as long as man is within the material world, it makes his observations through the senses and thinks with his intellect. He is standing in the 4th sphere, the Earth sphere. If he develops his faculties of soul sufficiently to be able to see the 3rd sphere, the Moon sphere, then he takes far flight. This will give you an inkling that the 8th sphere is to be observed within the Earth sphere. It cannot properly be drawn either above or below. To depict the reality, it would have to be sketched into the Earth sphere. And this is what he does over and over again. Whenever he draws the 8th sphere, it's not like, here's the 8th sphere, here's the Earth, here's the Moon. It's always, here's the Moon and the Earth, and this thing is around it. So, you know, when we hear about things like the space fence, for example, that's under development by Lockheed Martin, you know, we start to see the pictures that they put out, and it's this huge kind of cage around the Earth. So we have to kind of put ourselves in that mindset that when we're talking about the 8th sphere, this is what he's talking about. That's a kind of physical representation of it. But it is, again, it's always around the Earth. It's not a separate thing over here. It's somehow the emanations of the Earth and the imagination are creating this thing. Okay.
Najat wanted to know, could the space fence be a blockade or an aid to the 8th sphere?
Well, it seems to be some kind of physical manifestation in relation to it, for sure. It's definitely not something to stop it.
Okay, so it's not a blockade.
No, because again, I think all those forces, like the military-industrial complex, the aerospace companies, all those forces are harmonic. That is scientific materialism, technological advancement. They're just locked in that. Now, we can be very spiritual and be very locked into technology advancement. You know, I mean, I edited information Mac Apple magazine for over a decade. I'm deep in the technology. So the idea is not to become a Luddite, but it is to see the challenge of the technology and use the technology properly. Because again, you can develop an atom bomb and you can use nuclear energy, like we try to get the Iranians to use nuclear energy, or you can make bombs with it and make the place a desert. So that's kind of a good way to describe it, which is it depends on what you do with the tool. But however, because it's getting so closely integrated with who we are, it's now starting to invade our spirituality. And we're going to have to, and we're in the era where we have to recognize those differences and acknowledge that the spirituality aspect is one and the technology is another, and we can't worship the technology. You know, we have to start with the spiritual aspect and move into the using the technology. In Steiner's work, actually, you're not supposed to just run away from Ahriman and these lower astral forces. You're actually supposed to face them, and through facing them, gain the abilities that they have, oddly enough. So he's not saying run from the stuff. He's saying face it, but don't fall for it. So I think that's important. Okay.
Jim Roy the Heretic says the hit Netflix movie Bird Box, which is a ridiculous name, with Sandra Bullock, who we love,
Yes.
Is Ahriman using movies, smartphones, AI, 5G, and the space fence combined for an 8th sphere takeover. Does this resonate with you? We're gonna have to see that. I didn't know about this.
That's pretty good. No, I haven't seen the movie, but Jim Roy always recommends the good stuff. So
he's way ahead of everybody.
You know it. We're gonna check that out. Now, I want to introduce something into this cosmology, which is that in anthroposophy, they often say that Ahrimanic forces and Luciferian forces get mixed up, and that we have to take on both of them, but they are two separate things. The Ahrimanic forces, everything is scientific materialism and all the rest. The Luciferian forces are fantasy oriented. And so they kind of consume humanity with fantasy. And now there are aspects, again, when you learn the technology aspect from Ahriman and when you learn the fantasy aspects from Lucifer, both can be converted into higher art, better machines, whatever it happens to be. But at their worst, using their shadow elements, with harmonic forces, you become locked in. It's that whole thing about placing your consciousness, like Elon Musk says, in an AI box. This is where that's a trap. That's a soul trap. On the Luciferian side, you get people into these fantasies and they, run off a cliff, basically.
I'm sure you've answered this in other shows, but I don't know the answer to it right now. So many people would say that if you're trapped in hell, if you truly repent, if you pray to Christ, there is redemption, there is salvation. In the eighth sphere, would that work? What is the way out if you're trapped?
Well, the only thing I can say about it is in terms of how anthroposophy has presented it. And maybe there's a little bit in Sennett's work that gives you an idea. But the idea is if you get sucked into it, it's funny because it leads right into this next portion. I'm just going to read this, actually. So what he's saying is what's happening in this period of time and why it's so dangerous is that these forces are now united, which is the Luciferian forces and the Ahrimanic forces are now one in this cause around the eighth sphere. And that's why there's this big, kind of harvesting that's going on. Now, this is a cosmology, remember, we're talking about, but he's talking about it very directly, and we can see it overlaps in society. He's looking at World War. He's seeing already in that period, they're using tanks and they're using machines to slaughter people better, basically. So we can see the negative side of the technology is immediately coming out, and the mystery schools are moving these people out to give us some idea about how we're going to fight it over the next 100 years, and especially now. I mean, obviously, when you see things like Boston Dynamics and all the rest of it rolling out these killer Terminator monsters, you know that eventually we're going to have to deal with it. And it's better to deal with it now while they're still not so powerful. Okay. So let's see. This is the quote. Basically, one of the things, what he's saying is if we lost now, if we gave ourselves over as a culture to the eighth sphere, these are some of the things he said could happen. Basically, at a certain point, quote, in truth, therefore, our Earth, the fourth sphere, is simply not what it appears outwardly to be. Were it really to consist of atoms, all these atoms would still be impregnated by formations belonging to the eighth sphere, which are perceptible only to visionary clairvoyance. These formations are present everywhere. So too is the spectre-like content of the eighth sphere, which can therefore be perceived just as actual specters are perceived. All earthly beings in existence are involved here. That's a pretty heavy quote. Lucifer and Ahriman forces strive unceasingly to draw from the earth's substances, which whatever they can snatch. It's a pretty interesting term for Steiner to use. Whatever they can snatch, whatever they can get their hands on, in order to form their eighth sphere, which then, when it is sufficiently advanced, will be detached from the earth and go its own way in the cosmos, together with Lucifer and Ahriman, in all of humanity that they've sucked into it. So back to the quote. Needless to say, the earth would then pass over to Jupiter as a mere torso. That is, the full development would be gone of all these beings. You just get a certain portion of them. But man, as you realize, has his established place in the whole of Earth evolution, for he is mineralized through and through. We're permeated by the mineralizing process, which itself is drawn into this battle, so that morsels of this substance can continually be wrested from it. Therefore, we ourselves are involved in the battle, Luciferic and Ahrimanic battle against the spirits of form, with the aim of wresting mineral substances away from us everywhere. So basically, every person that they can convert into this fantasy state or You often hear about demonic possession or whatever it happens to be, but each one of them empowers and emboldens this eighth sphere idea. This is what Steiner is saying the warning is, that when they get to a sufficient strength, when they're able to really dominate the culture and they're just harvesting humanity, then the eighth sphere will become a reality, and it will become this artificial step. And even on a soul level, after the souls depart the earth, instead of going through that normal chain of evolution and coming back and reincarnating, they're going to go into the eighth sphere, and it's going to seem like they're going into a normal state because they've been dominated here on earth. It's quite a heavy thing to digest, but I think what Steiner is giving us, and then the reflections that we get now into AI and transhumanism, which is where we're going to go next, now we have the setup for what is actually happening underneath the surface. So I'm going to remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, and I mean deep, on the eighth sphere. There's no question about it. Go for it, Miss Olivia.
Cheryl Peterson was saying that the Bird Box movie is triggering people. And Kate Schneider said that it's giving people like headaches and things.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Whoa, that is fascinating. I'm going to have to dig deeper into it. But we know that if it's getting those types of reactions, that's quite fascinating.
That can be a reaction when you're dealing with the truth.
Right.
It's being revealed to you.
Yeah. Are you saying they can't handle the
truth? Some people would say it's an archonic reaction, right? That they're punishing you for being exposed to something that's going to wake you up. That's immediately what I thought of. Saying, you don't want to look at that.
Yes.
We're going to make you uncomfortable if you look at that.
That is fascinating. Well, I'll tell you, we get the most incredible movie lists, and we know that they reveal the most truth there. So I'm always watching out for that. I do think that these things being revealed through Hollywood, it's kind of fascinating because, we have these people who say there's a rule that's fundamental among these sort of Illuminati left-hand groups. And the term Illuminati is so loosey-goosey, but we'll use it for the hell of it, which is that they need to announce these things before they do them. I do think it's quite interesting that there's a kind of magic to that. Just like when groups like Amazon, the corporations realize that they're using an occult magic when they say we're here to serve you, because service is the formula. So they know that they're utilizing it, but they might be serving you to have better entree to you. So it's like, what is that Little Red Riding Hood? All the better to see you with, my dear. Okay, so now here's the fundamental crux of everything that I've led up to with Steiner and his quotes. And I wanted to go heavy on Steiner's quotes tonight to let him speak for himself. This is his take on the eighth sphere and what's happening. This is what it's set up for. Ready? Let's see if you recognize something like the internet in relation to this. Remember, he's writing in 1920. Quote, I repeat then, since the last third of the 19th century, spiritual beings from the cosmos have been coming into our sphere of existence. Their home is the sphere lying between the moon and Mercury, but they already are pressing forward into the realm of Earth existence. Okay. So there are these beings. This is the period of time when they were coming in the 19th century. Those beings that are coming in, according to Steiner, are a block against this other thing that's happening as a result of Ahriman's forces coming in. Here's the Ahriman effect. From the earth, there will spring forth a terrible brood of beings, a brood of automation, of an order of existence lying between the mineral and plant kingdoms. Now remember, mineral is technology. It's just literally any mineral, any rock, metal, all the rest of it. So when they speak about it here, he's speaking about it in the abstract, plant, mineral. But he's basically talking about the materials that they'll use to deliver the technology. From the earth, there will spring forth a terrible brood of beings, a brood of automation of an order of existence lying between the mineral and the plant kingdoms and possessed of an overwhelming power of intellect. Computer chips. I added the computer chips, by the way. Back to the quote. This swarm will seize upon the earth, will spread over the earth like a network of ghastly spider-like creatures. Well, it's very interesting, actually, when you think about it, considering what we're talking about. of a lower order than that of plant existence, but possessed of overpowering wisdom. These spidery creatures will be all interlocked with one another, and in their outward movements they will imitate the thoughts that men have spun out of the shadowy intellect that has not allowed itself to be quickened by the new form of imaginative knowledge of spiritual science that the mystery schools are moving forward. So instead you have this kind of dull humanity and these things coming in, which he's describing as spiders and webs taking over with incredibly keen intellects. So he's looking out over this and he's seeing these kind of computer developments and AI technology. Okay. This swarm will seize upon the earth, will spread over the earth like a network of ghastly spider-like creatures of a lower order than the plant existence, but possessed of an overpowering wisdom. These spidery creatures will all be interlocked with each other, and in their outward movements they will imitate the thoughts that men have spun out of the shadowy intellect. The earth will be surrounded, as it is now, with air, and as it is sometimes, with swarms of locusts, with a brood of terrible spider-like creatures, half mineral, half plant, interweaving with masterly intelligence. Now, I will tell you that Steiner will use this language, this kind of broad cosmological language when he's describing something, almost in a Nostradamian kind of way of giving us the idea of what it is. But he's talking about webs, networks, spiders, and he's talking basically, you know, the internet to the public hits in about 1993. And here he is speaking in 1920, 73 years earlier. All right, let's keep going with that.
I just want to say the chat got very quiet.
Yeah, I know.
He's really listening intently right now.
When Steiner gets into predictions, it's heavy. He doesn't say things lightly. So interweaving with masterly intelligence. It is true, but with intensely evil intent. So I'm going to read that again. The earth will be surrounded, as it is now, with air, and as it sometimes is with swarms of locusts, like a brood of terrible spider-like creatures, half mineral, half plant, interweaving with masterly intelligence. It is true, but with intensely evil intent. So it's the technology, the artificial intelligence technology, but the people behind it have very dark intentions. So let's keep rolling. And insofar as man has not allowed his shadowy intellectual concepts to be quickened to life, his existence will be united not with beings who've been trying to descend since the last third of the 19th century, that higher evolution that the mystery schools have been setting us up for, but instead with this ghastly brood of half mineral, half plant-like creatures merging humanity into the technology. That's problematic.
Gigi actually said spiders have 8 legs, 8th sphere.
Oh, isn't that fascinating? Excellent, excellent point. And that's just the kind of thing that Steiner would use as a metaphor.
So what is this? What are you quoting from?
This is a series of lectures that he gave. And it's actually, this one is from 1921, The Picture of Earth Evolution in the Future. Now, I want to say something about this. So he's saying, instead of merging as it's supposed to with its kind of higher counterparts at this point, it's going to get curtailed by this Ahrimanic hit and going to merge with these strange spider-like creatures, mineralized, which is all this technology spreading through them. This is how he's describing it. His existence will be united not with the beings who have been trying to descend since the last third of the 19th century, but with the ghastly brood of half-mineral, half-plant-like creatures. He'll have to live together with these spider-like creatures and continue his cosmic existence within the order of evolution into which this brood will then enter. That is, the artificial intelligence will actually become part of the soul evolutionary wave, dragging the soul down even beyond its earth existence. This is a destiny that is very empathically part of human evolution upon the earth, and is quite well known today by many of those who try to hold humanity back from the knowledge of spiritual science. Remember that the media, the religious institutions, the mainstream scientific establishment, a big part of their goal, strangely enough, is to hold us back from this knowledge. For there are men who are actually conscious allies of this process of the entanglement of Earth existence. Now, that's very, very deep. What he's saying is that there were people involved in these secret societies working to bring about this reality. That's 1921. Here we are 100 years later in the thick of it. Okay, just a little more from the quote of this lecture. We must no longer allow ourselves to be shocked by descriptions of this kind. Such facts are the background of what is often said today by people who, out of old traditions, still have some consciousness of these things, who then see fit to surround them with the veil of mystery. But it is not right any longer for the process of earthly evolution of humanity to be veiled in mystery. However great the resistance, these things must be said, for, as I constantly repeat, the acceptance or rejection of spiritual scientific knowledge is a grave matter for all mankind. This is the key point. We're looking at something where he's saying the mystery schools are, there's a group of mystery schools that still hold back on that. And because of that, these other groups, the left-hand schools, working with these Ahrimanic forces, have set up this AI nightmare. And that if we don't let the information out, and if the society does not catch on to the spiritual scientific anthroposophic mystery school reality, we're stuck imbibing, taking on the characterization of this weird artificial intelligence aspect that he's describing here in this spidery fashion. So, we can go deeper and deeper into that, but I think we get the message. So I guess the point here is that he's saying, look, this is not an abstraction. The Ahrimanic forces aren't something for you to think about and wonder, oh, there's some evil thing out there. It's something that's active inside of the culture, and it's growing, and that the awareness of it and the awareness of that the mystery schools are trying to bring out goes far beyond just whether we're uptight about left-wing politics or right-wing politics. It is an actual spiritual battle playing out in the middle of the 21st century with these forces. And we're looking at it from the technological aspect, the spiritual aspect, the geopolitical aspect, even the economic aspect. We're in the middle of a clash, a major clash. And if we don't have the tools of understanding what the mystery schools have left to us as a legacy, if we get wrapped up in, as we see a lot of things happen on the independent media side, you get a lot of 2 minutes hate, where they're just hating on one particular political figure. We get ourselves wrapped up in that. And then the mainstream media feeds you trash and, the CNN Anderson Cooper world. That's a complete farce. So both sides, you're really not getting it. If we don't get it on the independent side, that's where we can get it. And we have to understand the legacy then that the mystery schools have left behind for us, because without understanding that legacy and pulling it through, we're subject to the Ahrimanic forces using this high technology to actually harvest humanity. We're right in the middle of that process. And the mystery schools have vouchsafed this important teaching for us to really give us a leg up in dealing with the battle, which is inevitable. And we see that battle, which is inevitable, even if you're talking about it cosmologically. We look at it on a daily basis with the driverless cars, the robot bartenders, and the things that are coming in, and the cashless society and the control grids that they're pushing toward us, and the 5G networks. This is all part of the same process. So I think there needs to be kind of a new dialogue, a new conversation about all this. That's what the mystery schools have set up for us. And you got something, Olivia.
Quantum Woodyat has something really interesting to add here. DJ, when I was staying nearby CERN, just outside of Switzerland, and my motel was right next to a large crystalline boulder, when I went to sleep, I saw these beings, and I think there's a connection.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Wow. First of all, falling asleep near CERN is, you should make a video on that all by itself. One last quote from Steiner here. To cultivate spiritual science, same lecture, by the way, to cultivate spiritual science is no abstract pursuit. To cultivate spiritual science means to open the doors to those influences from beyond the earth, which have been seeking to come down to the earth. So we're actually the doorway. Since the last third of the 19th century, The cultivation of spiritual science is in very truth a cosmic event to which we ought to be fully conscious. This is very significant, I think, especially in this period, because the thing that we're rolling toward is set out here by Ray Kurzweil, which is the singularity. And actually, I'm not going to show you his chart. I'm just going to read you. One of the things I wanted to point out about Kurzweil is he's one of these people who wants to merge with machines, and he's a real thought leader of the transhumanists. And, you know, it's interesting because Kurzweil makes fantastic synthesizers and things. And, you know, you want to admire these people just on that level. But somehow when they get into this, you know, we're going to be gods with technology thing, it's kind of a sickness, an illness, really. Now, one of the things, if you've been following this show, is that we've talked a lot about how the X technology is hidden in the UFO file. And we've identified 3 people who managed the UFO file, Vannevar Bush, Arthur Compton, and then the person who managed it for 9 years, John von Neumann. Well, oddly enough, Kurzweil touches on the history of the singularity concept, this singularity where we merge with machines, basically. Kurzweil traces it back to John von Neumann in the 1950s. So the man who managed the UFO file, according to physicist Robert Sarbarker, for a decade almost, he's the one that Kurzweil is getting the singularity concept from. That should start to give us some idea of what is behind some of this thought and what we might be looking at. Okay. He compares his singularity to that of a mathematical or astrophysical singularity. While his ideas of a singularity is not actually infinite, he says it looks that way from any limited perspective. During the singularity, Kurzweil predicts that human life will be irreversibly transformed and that humans will transcend the limitations of our biological bodies and brain. He looks beyond the singularity to say that intelligence that will emerge will continue to represent human civilization. Further, he feels that future machines will be human even if they are not biological. So we'll have downloaded our consciousness into these mineral objects. Remember the spiders that Steiner talked about? Kurzweil claims once non-biological intelligence predominates, the nature of human life will be radically altered. There'll be radical changes in how humans learn, work, play, and wage war. Isn't that nice? They'll have a whole new way to wage war. So he envisions nanobots which allow people to eat whatever they want while remaining thin and fit, providing copious energy, fight off infections of cancer, replace organs, and augment their brains. So they promise this kind of weird nirvana by sucking into this robot cyborg reality. Now, here's something that I know and that I've discussed with Dr. Joseph Farrell on this program, which is in the original Hermetic Tree of Life, in that alchemical setup, what they have is set up in the Tree of Life is that there's the animal portion is here, and the next step up is mineral. And that this move up to mineral is something which they're trying to do with their consciousness without actually achieving the spiritual development that it takes to climb the Tree of Life, which is actually a pattern that's set up by the mystery schools over many years about how you need to grow up through this Tree of Life to fully evolve. And what they're trying to do is sort of short circuit that process by taking on the mineralization aspect and projecting their consciousness into this cyborg that can have any pleasure that it wants and be, totally have a great time. This is so interesting because when you really tie it in with what Steiner said about the eighth sphere, what happens when you project yourself and you allow yourself to be part of this mineral consciousness? You're getting locked into this kind of false reality, and you're getting sucked in to this soul evolutionary process, which is taking you about as far afield from your normal spiritual evolution as we can imagine. So this is the great clash that's going on. The mystery schools say, through the Anthroposophical Society, that the clash is through the Ahrimanic forces, and that those forces are intentionally evil, and that their process is basically to trick humanity into accepting them and to become subject to them in the eighth sphere. That is the cosmology of anthroposophy, but it seems like something that we're living in right in the period that we're in. And with that, Miss Olivia, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, so I was starting to have a really deep thought. I may hold on.
I know,
to it.
no, I want to hear it. I want to hear it.
Okay, well, Sarabella Gignac
Yes.
says Satan, Jesus, God, and God's creations are all made in the image of God. What is above, below, without is inside. DNA created the blueprint for AI, is a counterfeit human. And I started thinking about
that's an interesting term, counterfeit human.
Counterfeit human. And I started thinking about how this has sort of happened before in a way. If you can say that what are the bodies we're in now? If these people who are, if humanity has transported its consciousness in the future into these
cyborgs,
technological
avatars.
Yeah. At some point, that's going to seem normal. They'll probably forget all about us. Any history of being organic,
Oh, they do. You're absolutely right.
So how do we know?
They want to make us.
Has it already are we that? Are we already one step away from our actual natural form as spirit?
They're moving. They're moving fast. They're moving fast.
No. I mean, being flesh and blood here.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying they're moving fast. If you think about it, think about the era that Steiner's talking in 1920. What was that life like? We still had horse and buggy in parts, even though we had the car and we had developed a certain aspect of technology. But really, I mean, largely, we were just coming out of this kind of agrarian existence and moving into the cities. And, that's just 100 years. And you think about the progress that they've had. They've gone to the moon. They've created a totally black space program. They've created massive underground bases. They've moved forward with technology. They've moved forward with creating cyborgs. So I think what was happening there is there's this period of time where somehow their work accelerated, maybe faster than the mystery schools realized. And just like Steiner says, I can't stand by and let this happen. It's in his lecture. The battle of the mystery schools is right there in his lecture when he says, literally, we can't keep this stuff a mystery anymore. You've got to get it out to the public. And, he did give us this timetable. Now, is Steiner good at predictions? We're finding out. It sounds pretty much like he was very good at it. But he also gave us the prediction that the mystery schools would have this opportunity again, this period 2020 here that we're in. I think it's a crucial realization on that part. No, go back to your questions.
Okay, so let's go through those spiders. So Matthew Cadlick says, talk to Linda Moulton Howe about the spider beings in Vietnam. Truth is stranger than fiction. And I remember she did.
True. Yeah, those things are interesting. People have these, and you hear a lot about this in that neck of the alternative world that's connected with like Project Camelot and stuff like that. They do talk about spider beings and astral beings. I think all that is actually quite true and very interesting. I don't know if it relates to this or not. I think what he's trying to describe there with that web is the interlocking Wi-Fi AI technology merging into this other thing. And God knows the plans and what they're actually working on and what they've actually developed. We've seen allusions to clone armies and things like that. But it seems to me that the Terminator robots that they've built at Boston Dynamics, which is really not very far from here, that stuff's terrifying because they enjoy it so much. They enjoy this idea that they can create these beings. And you can very easily see that the consciousness of the leadership on the political side, they do not have the moral character, ethical development to handle that kind of power. So I think we're in a situation where, we have to call time out on the kind of reality TV vibe and get real about what's happening. 2019 is a great year to face transhumanism dead on. I actually think it's the topic we should talk about the most, and we are able to bring in the setup that the mystery schools have left behind for us. I think that's crucial. Okay, keep rolling.
Thomas Tyson wanted to say,
yes,
quote, weaving spiders come not here, unquote, is the Bohemian Grove motto.
Oh, yes, yeah. Right? Yeah, okay.
And Carl Jung said, spiders will weave a web catching humans. So, and then we will move on from our spider talk.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, Bowie said we're the spiders from Mars, right? It is interesting because the spider aspect, I think, goes pretty deep because, spiders show up in native traditions as, isn't it like grandmother spider and things like
Yes.
that? They have knowledge and wisdom and history. This thing is some kind of weird distortion that he's talking about, that he's trying to get across to us. But the mystery schools are probably preventing him outright from saying, look, you can't say they're going to develop artificial intelligence and take us on. You're going to have to couch it in some kind of language that they're going to be able to open it up and explain it 100 years from now. There's a lot of time capsules inside of Steiner's work. I've seen them over and over again. And the Goetheanum itself is a kind of time capsule, I would say, the building that he made to house the headquarters there, that the Nazis burnt down originally. By the way, they had to rebuild it after he died because the Nazis regarded Steiner as a huge enemy because they were using the occult stuff too, but they were using it for those darker purposes. So they looked at him and he was public enemy number one when they were starting. So we have to keep that in mind. And also the fact that Steiner survived many assassination attempts bringing this information out. And in fact, although anthroposophy doesn't like to make a big deal out of this, he was assassinated. In the end, he was poisoned. And that's on record. And Steiner himself made a point that they shouldn't bring this out so much because he didn't want to be remembered as just this leader who had been killed. But that the Brotherhoods of the Left Hand actually celebrated Steiner's death. And Steiner's work, I think, stands as a real complete move by the mystery schools to bring out the truth for us. And it was vouchsafed. It's definitely a time capsule for us to open up now and work with. And it's been in development now. Remember, the goal behind the mystery schools is that they spread the seeds out and then they withdraw and they see how humanity does with it, and then they move back in. So I think we've been in that period where the tide was out, and now the tide's coming back in because we're going to need it. Okay, keep going.
Leela Bear says, bottom line,
yes,
we have to save everyone from being tempted into the eighth sphere, or we'll all suffer an evolutionary setback?
No, you become aware of it yourself, basically, and you try to bring that awareness. If you feel that it's valid, then you try to bring that awareness for sure. And I would also say this, that, the eighth sphere, the culture is largely an eighth sphere Ahrimanic culture right now. That is, it's driven by money, it's driven by fame, it's not very advanced. The millennial generation that they've developed here, they're not given a proper outlet for their creativity, and they're not given a proper outlet for developing their spirituality. So I think that things get progressively worse on that end. However, I think that the incredible opportunities exist now for them to be the ultimate generation for picking this up and driving the point home, because at a certain point, what's happening actually is that the technology is just being rolled down on them. And there's, you have these little kids walking around with iPads and stuff, and that would be great. That would be great if it's a balanced upbringing. But you really see that what we're getting out of it is that people who aren't very good, they don't develop the right social skills. Their intelligence level can drop dramatically depending on the kind of content that they receive, and they're so easily manipulated on a political basis with here's what to get offended by next, that they become the ultimate tool of the CFR major media companies. So remember, very often when we're talking about the mystery schools, we're talking about the deep state too, because very often they're interlocked. The darker side of the mystery schools runs rampant in those secret societies that run the geopolitical situation. And then you have the mystery schools that are trying to move the culture forward and really give us those more benevolent influences. Like Steiner's work. Okay, yes.
Jonathan Paul de Veerville says, how does the Christ impulse and the mystery of Golgotha play into this?
Well, that is the mystery of Golgotha in the Steiner work, the crucifixion, sets back Ahriman dramatically because it introduces a new impulse into Earth evolution. That's what the mystery schools had developed up to that point to do. And that's why the Western mystery tradition was set up to take over. The Western esoteric tradition had been set up out of the Essenes who had developed Christ. Now, the Eastern initiators were merged into that process. They had developed it too. They had set up for 3,000 years for this to happen. So they all work interlocked. The problem is that the period of time that we're in requires, according to the mystery schools from the Rosicrucian anthroposophical angle, it requires the Western esoteric tradition. That is, it requires that kind of esoteric Christianity that includes the Eastern concepts like reincarnation, like higher abilities, psychic understanding, all of these different things. So it's not so much, very often I think that individuals had gone through maybe bad experiences with Christian religion. And so they run into the Buddhist side. But the thing is, deep inside the mystery traditions around what the Essenes did, setting up the Christian religion and the esoteric Christianity, that's a whole different thing. And the regular Christian church actually persecutes the esoteric Christianity church. Because, of course, if you go into a regular Christian church and start talking about, this is like Edgar Casey when he was a Sunday school teacher and they found out he was talking about reincarnation, they booted him. So, there's value in all of these different traditions, but they all need to move deeper because the information is now available. Just like Egyptology, I make this point very often. Most of Egyptology was set up in the 18th century before you had any radar or any way to really check these things out. So all the stupid dating and everything that they have about these kings and the dynasties are all wrong because they didn't have the tools to go back and really do it properly. So a lot of those kind of establishment, overlords have to change their tune because we just moved into another era, and they're going to hang on to that old version of the story because that's where they get their power from. So we're in a very tricky situation, and remember, it's always the narrative over and over again. Okay, yes.
Okay, all right. Let's throw them all a bone. Okay, Najat Madri, did Steiner predict humanity getting out of this mess? And JJK, did Steiner predict anything positive for us in this time?
Of course he did. Well, the whole thing is positive, really, because even the battle is required. The important thing, in his opinion, was that Ahriman was going to be incarnated. I actually think Ahriman could be incarnated as a cyborg figure. He knew inevitably Ahriman was going to be incarnated in this millennium. Okay, probably over the course of the next 100 years. So what we're looking at there is, a clash where if we can face it, we come out the other end much better. But, he has things that he's predicted, like the war of all against all, and we're seeing this. So he's not so much saying, look, there's not going to be any trouble. It's funny, if you look at Theosophy, they're like, hey, we're going to move into this new root race. And once we get to that new root race, they're going to be naturally spiritual and all these great things are going to happen. They don't talk about the Ahrimanic battle. I don't know what was going on there and how there's a disconnect. And I don't consider Steiner any kind of fear porn, but his version of the future is much more challenging. It all depends on the fact, I guess Theosophy is set up around the idea that we will wake up to it. But Steiner is looking at that, the odds of that, and he's saying, look, it could go either way. So if we don't wake up to it, it's going to come down like, Niagara Falls, and we're going to be in a situation where we just get flooded by these Ahrimanic forces. So he's stepping up to say, look, I'm moving the mystery tradition out into the public because they need the tools to battle this thing that's coming. And I think when we really look at it, if we really are honest with ourselves, look at what's happened over the course of even the past 20 years. I mean, they have really, little by little, taken so much of the soul out of the country and the world. And I think that we're standing on the precipice of a completely soulless society. So there's so much trapped potential, I think, that we have and that we need to move forward. So we're in a very special situation. There's no question about it. Okay.
Okay, Thomas Tyson, can DJ elaborate on Zoroastrianism, where the concept and word Ahriman originated?
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, Ahriman is very interesting because in Zoroastrianism, Persian religion, he is the twin brother of Ahura Mazda, and Ahura Mazda is the kind of Christ figure. And Ahura Mazda has to stay on him nonstop. They always depict him putting a sword through his forehead and through his stomach. And Ahriman is depicted very often as a chimeron. Of course, I showed the Steiner sculpture of Ahriman. I mean, that's pretty, he's got kind of a pretty evil, demonic look to him. And that's interesting because Steiner went into a clairvoyant trance to kind of get a feel for him. And as he was going into that trance, he felt that he was being moved into deep concrete and everything was slow and he was getting heavy. And so whatever that Ahrimanic thing is, it's so material and so dense that it just brings you down. But I think the traditional character of Ahriman in that battle with Ahura Mazda is thought of as he's the traditional devil in that setup. But it is very interesting that he's the twin of Christ in that setup. He's the twin of the Savior, and he's kind of the exact dark shadow side. So it really makes you wonder about Ahriman. Look, you can go so deep when you're looking at Steiner's work. And I have, in one of the books that I think is particularly good, let me see if I can get this here. There's a few that I really recommend. But I mean, An Outline of Occult Science, certainly. But this one, where they've taken excerpts from The Mystery of the Double, it's called The Electronic Doppelganger. And it's a series of lectures where he talks about this doppelganger. And it seems to me that when he gets into that, that's when we're getting to the Ahrimanic thing. It's almost like we're dealing with the world shadow there, or creation's shadow. And it's actually quite deep when you go into it, because in Steiner's history, he says that the moon came out of the earth, and that when it was in the earth and it had not departed, that Ahriman basically ruled the roost, and that when it left, mankind got a break, in a sense, because it developed more freedom away from Ahriman. But there was a point there, we have a memory of this kind of early merging with the Ahrimanic forces, and so they got into our evolutionary process, and you have to deal with it. It's like dealing with the shadow side in Jungian psychology. So I think the cosmology that Steiner's laying out there is a lot deeper the more you go into it, because it has aspects which are physical, like we have to face the transhumanist forces, but it's also talking psychologically about something. Okay, yes.
Okay, this always comes up,
Yes.
but Guitar Dave says, does anyone notice that Ahriman and that ugly green-faced blank that they show at the end of the original Star Trek TV shows, look exactly alike? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think what episode that is. That is the one. It's the one with the baby.
Yeah, it's the one you.
It's yes, and that is a terrifying face, and it does. There's all kinds of Steiner concepts in popular culture. I prove that the Matrix, the red pill and the blue pill, comes directly out of Steiner's blue pillar, red pillar. You adopt one or the other. Those people read Steiner. Twin Peaks, of course, The Dweller and the Threshold, that's directly out of Knowledge of Higher Worlds. So we see that in Star Trek. You definitely see it also, and they're pulling on that. I mean, I'm glad they've incorporated it, actually. But very
Christine
often
Taggart,
Steiner's uncredited, though.
The Corbomite maneuver.
Corbomite maneuver. Yeah. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
I should have remembered.
Nicely done. I want to remind everyone that you're watching A Dark Journalist, and it's fantastic. We've gone very deep on this subject here in episode 42 of The Eighth Sphere. There's no stopping the deep Steiner anthroposophical look at this, and in theosophy and the foundations that the mystery schools have given us. So it is the kind of thing which is, it's not light reading, but it gets us very far down the road. And another one of those books I want to recommend, I often recommend this, I call it the front line of the battle of the mystery schools, about 1890. 5 lectures by C.G. Harrison for something called the Berrien Group. And C.G. Harrison definitely being a member of a mystery school who needed to come out and talk about what had happened to Blavatsky and how she was kept in something called occult imprisonment. It's all in here, and it's a very short book, actually. I think it's about 150 pages. But that, along with the Steiner material, we get a snapshot, just a little bit, of what was happening with the mystery schools. And I think with Emma Britton, that's another person from that period who really opens this up. We're going to take a couple more questions. I want to remind everyone to go to Dark Journalist, sign up for the newsletter, and that keeps us in touch, especially with the incredible social media shutdowns that are going on. The only way we can really stay in touch is through our own newsletter, and that's kind of a pipeline directly. You basically just get a newsletter about once a week, and it'll tell you the guests that are coming up, and we have amazing guests coming up for later in January and February. Okay, Miss Olivia.
So what was that book you just mentioned? That it was a little fast.
Oh, it's the Transcendental Universe.
Okay.
Yes.
Alrighty.
Okay, keep rolling.
Okay. So
great people out there too tonight. It's a huge crowd, and we have some really great questions happening.
Okay. So Jonathan Paul de Veerville, again, wanted to know, who might Steiner have been reincarnated from, and what were his spiritual guides?
Well, it's pretty interesting. I'll tell you what's funny, which is at the end of their lives in Theosophy, some of the great masters like Ledbetter and Besant and Blavatsky will reveal their previous lives, and they don't talk about them while they're alive and pump them up so much and say, like, I was so-and-so, isn't that great? One of the ones I found interesting was that Besant, interestingly enough, had been a figure in history that had been burnt at the stake for revealing knowledge about astronomy, and that is Giordano Bruno. I found that very interesting because when we look at Besant's life, she's always the iconoclast throwing the power structure off. And in terms of Steiner, you know, he studied Goethe so closely, and we get so much from Goethe. He made the Goetheanum, of course, which is a tribute to Goethe, his building, his main headquarters. And the theory of knowledge he did based on Goethe's work. That's how he came to prominence, really, being a Goethe scholar. And Goethe gave us Faust, which is an incredible mystery school play, along with The Green Snake and the Lily, which is one of those kind of Alice in Wonderland type mystic, well, it's a poem really more than a story, but I think what we get there is a possibility. If I were to guess, I would guess that Steiner was an incredibly advanced adept when he came in. There's just no doubt about it. I actually I found a picture of his master, this gardener, which I will show as we go along here. But I guess we can take the next question anyway.
Okay, I have to ask this question for Lauren D, who's flipping out.
I know.
Okay, so
Yes.
ask DJ about Prokofiev's work on Steiner's anthroposophy. My roommate considers Prokofiev's work just as important as Steiner's.
That's interesting. But that's Peter and the Wolf, Prokofiev. So that's interesting. There's a lot of people who come out of that tradition and who tried to, like Owen Barfield and people of this ilk, who brought anthroposophy out later. And someone else wrote The Circle of the 12. But, you know, it's fascinating. Maybe it's just me, but it seems to me that the people who picked up the torch in relation to the Gurdjieff work, people who picked up the torch in relation to the Steiner work, and the people who picked up the torch in the relation to Theosophy became caretakers of the tradition of the work. And I personally don't feel so much that it opened up that much. So I feel like we get this initial incredible wave, like lightning strikes, and out of the blue, we've got Blavatsky, we've got Steiner, we've got Ouspensky, we've got Gurdjieff, we've got Edgar Cayce. And, you know, the people who came afterwards, they're a different type of wave. They're not those types of figures. And they sort of become caretakers, like I said. So I haven't regarded them as highly.
Okay, a cult fan is actually correcting it. It's Prokofiev, who I do not know.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, this falls into that whole kind of Circle of the 12 thing that comes after anthroposophy. And it is interesting, but I guess, like I said, just like when people talk about Alice Bailey, what it is really is it's a holdover. It's like a next generation movement around it. And these things have to happen, and I'm sure they have their own level of viability. But I haven't been particularly struck by anything post the original, explosion. I will say that J.G. Bennett, having worked with both Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, brought his tradition out in probably the best way. And on the Steiner side, that's hard. There's a guy in Europe now, Thomas Meyer, who's done so much good work around it. But nothing, I think, these characters are so extraordinary that we're left in awe trying to figure out what their legacy is. So it's hard. But yeah, I'm sure the work is very interesting. Okay, keep rolling.
Titan Blood wanted to know, is Steiner's work a complete system for spiritual development?
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the most balanced systems for it because it's based on spiritual science, and the first rule is you kind of have to be responsible for your own development. So that's a very anti-guru setup. No question about it. And Steiner includes the threefold social development. So he's got a social wing. He's got the biodynamic farming. He's got eurythmy, the anthroposophical treatment, Waldorf teaching for early childhood education. It's a very complete system. And, I think that there's so much to continue in his tradition. And I will say this, that it seems like as far as an overall tradition worldwide, it's fared the best out of all these traditions, whereas Theosophy really had a cutoff point. The Gurdjieff work seemed to do its best while he was alive. Steiner's work has progressively grown, anthroposophical centers, the schools, etc. So he's planted some of the best seeds. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay, a cult fan is asking, is the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks the eighth sphere?
The Black Lodge is the left-hand school in the Twin Peaks setup. From what I've deduced from watching it, you have the left-hand schools, and then the White Lodge, you have the Great White Brotherhood, basically. And the tip-off is one of the characters talks about the dweller on the threshold. That'll give you a pretty good idea. But yeah, that's a fascinating question.
I do think it's interesting that in the Twin Peaks: The Return, the degradation of our world, of Twin Peaks, the town itself, it's everything as sort of we all are entering the eighth sphere. It's not so much the technology, but everybody's on drugs. I mean, you look at the old series,
Yes.
and everybody's young and beautiful and healthy. Even the middle-aged characters were young and healthy and and then, but the world around is just completely
There's no
degenerated.
question.
Wouldn't you say that was an influence of Ahriman?
In those 25 years, absolutely. Something dramatic happens to that show. And I thought The Return was quite good, actually, what they did with it. And
It
Lynch
had incredibly transcendent moments.
Well,
of
Lynch is
brilliance.
very, very deep. He's very deep. He has his own transcendental meditation center. And you said something very interesting about how they did the backwards language on that when they went into that lodge. Do you remember any of that? It was that some of the actors had learned the language.
No, the dwarf actor, I think his name was Anderson, actually knew that language, knew how to do that from his childhood, where he did that with his friends.
Yes.
So and he wasn't hired for that reason. David Lynch only found that out after the fact, and then fired the speech coach because he didn't need him. That is so crazy.
That is beyond bizarre.
Michael Anderson, that's his name, Michael J. Anderson.
That's really what happens sometimes. But I'll tell you what is fascinating, which is you will find, just like they had the midget and the giant in that setup, you'll find this over and over again. We were reviewing the W56. I did the last interview with Timothy Good, who was one of the greatest UFO researchers. And he has retired for health reasons, but his last interview is up there on my channel, and it's all about the W56, or this incredible friendship UFO contact case. And they have this dark and light thing going on where they're the friendship group W56 coming to help humanity, and they're battling the CT group. And but the stories are so authentic that come out of that, but associated with them are this giant and this dwarf, just like in the Twin Peaks mythology. So I'm sure they watch that stuff very, very closely.
That is one amazing documentary.
It is.
Those
yeah.
people are telling the truth.
Well, it's very interesting. If you go back and listen to Timothy Good's work on it, he's not someone to take the subject lightly. He went very deep with it. Okay, keep rolling.
Daniel Natal said something really interesting. Andrew Jackson Davis said Afterlife was Summerland. In
Yes.
1916, Sir Oliver Lodge's dead son said that he was in Summerland, and he described 7 spheres. When asked what was beyond the 7th, he said God.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Wow. Well, look, the Poughkeepsie seer, Andrew Jackson Davis, is quite interesting. He's like an early version of Edgar Cayce. And he shows up in Steiner's work. There's a book I want everyone to get a crack at. I wonder if I have it here. Yes. This is a series of lectures. It doesn't get any better than this. This is a series of lectures called Spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky, and Theosophy, an Eyewitness View of Cult History. It's taken from 8 different lectures that Steiner gave about Blavatsky. And he shows her virtues in it, and basically how even with her flaws, none of this could have happened without her. She's a transformational figure. She brings the mystery schools on board. She has the ability to do it. She has the mediumistic clairvoyance to make it happen. She's the foundation. There is no anthroposophy without Blavatsky. There's no theosophy. So Blavatsky is this incredible breakthrough figure, and understanding Blavatsky can help us to understand her interfacing with the mystery schools, because remember this, which is that in the Secret Doctrine, she brings forward basically most of the esoteric foundation that we have out there that's public and that we could build on with things like anthroposophy. And that her main thing when she came to America and started theosophy, she went to the mystery schools that were here. She identified them. And some of them were up in the air about her because they were working in a kind of a backwards direction, controlling the political process. And she said, look, you have to admit me because I want to join. And they were a little bit from a political angle saying, well, you know, she's Russian. There are some issues here. And they said, look, we don't admit women. It's simple. And she said, well, you know, basically these brotherhoods in France will admit me, and I'll let them know your secrets because I know them. So they turned against her, and Blavatsky had this incredibly difficult time, and C.G. Harrison describes it as a cult imprisonment, where when she went to go into these states, they had created a false reality around her, a kind of a personal 8th sphere to help dominate her clairvoyance. And if you look at her output after this, it becomes very uneven and erratic. But I think that she shook the system up so much, and there's so much going on behind the scenes with these groups and these secret societies, you know, some good, but some not so good. And those revelations and shaking up that system had ripples that went everywhere. And so one of the things that Steiner brought forward in relation to speaking about Blavatsky is speaking about how the mystery schools are intertwined with the political process like that. So if you're dealing with a political process, you're dealing either with the benevolent mystery schools that want to move the culture forward, or the left-hand schools and secret societies that want to keep all the secrets to themselves, basically, and to control humanity as they have done, using that geopolitical board of influences. So when you learn about theosophy and anthroposophy, you learn politics, you learn how the deep state was born and how it operates now. So these things definitely are intertwined. Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions. You're watching Dark Journalist. This is episode 42. Of course, you can find us doing the live X series every Friday night at 7 p.m. We started at 7:30 tonight, but
which may be our new time.
Well, we've been talking about it because so many of you joined later. But I will say this, that we had a show on New Year's, and we were talking all about the various things that are happening coming up here for 2019. And it was a fantastic show, and it was great to be with everyone. But coming up are really some of the best. There's some incredible things that are going on behind the scenes right now, which we're going to try to bring out to you over the course of the next 4 to 6 weeks. And we are very excited about those developments. and some of the people that we're talking to who we are going to bring onto the show. Of course, the work that we're doing on the Ernest Hemingway family legacy through his family and the Atlantis Bimini connection on the Atlantis Rising work is continuing, and you can expect to see a lot more about that and some amazing breakthroughs coming on that tip. Okay, we'll take the last 3 questions.
Okay, My Soul on Fire is saying that she is not getting notified anymore, even though I have the bell clicked and notifications on.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, we have all kinds of problems with YouTube and Google, and there's definitely, Cliff High looked into it, and he said that there was a process. I forget exactly what he called it, but they keep us in this like real review process, which slows down everything with how people get contacted by us. That's why I say the best thing to do is to come around to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter.
Yeah, just sign up for the newsletter. It's free, and you'll get notified before the show.
That's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. And I do feel that you can't trust YouTube. You just won't know. But predominantly, I mean, you're going to find us Fridays at 7 anyway.
Okay. Mirror 13. Has DJ ever contacted the Anthroposophical Society in America? If so, I am curious if they are familiar with this series.
They're pretty familiar with the series.
Well, we know the Steiner people are familiar with the series.
They are. The Steiner people are the Anthroposophical centers.
Yeah.
And well, a number of them, actually, it's very fascinating, the people that we talk to on that tip. And I would say that they follow the work that we're doing here, and they think of it as, I mean, I can't speak for all of them, of course, but certainly for the ones we've talked to, they think of it as enlightening and complementary with what they teach. And I would say that it's very interesting, when you come to certain areas where Steiner's really successful, like the Waldorf schools, for example, they don't want to talk about Steiner and Atlantis. They don't want to talk about Steiner and Armon. That seems really on the fringe to them. They just want to present to moms and dads, hey, your kids will have a good education using these techniques. But the funny thing is, I think the Steiner work is really holistic in that sense that all these things work together. I found this a long time ago when I was at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and I had the great honor of meeting Edgar Evans Cayce, who's Edgar's son, and some of the Cayce family and the people who work there. And I've gone there a number of times, and my impression was that there's a little bit of they don't like to get into Cayce's Atlantis work. They don't like to promote that. They talk a lot about his holistic healing. They talk a lot about his faith initiatives. But the Atlantis work, for me, is the most cutting-edge stuff that Edgar Cayce did, completely blowing away anyone's information about ancient Atlantis, talking about their advanced technology, the Two-Eye Stone, how the Two-Eye Stone basically demolished and submerged Atlantis, and how it dominated all these cultures, and how it was used not only scientifically as a technological device, but it was used spiritually, and they had priestesses who worked with the Two-Eye Stone to interface with these spiritual beings. So it's such a rich story, and I do feel that some of these groups don't do us such a credit, really. They don't do us any favors by keeping the really edgy stuff, because their mainline people may not appreciate it. Their mainline people might be conservative in a way. I think that information on the Cayce, I really don't feel we've explored it properly at all. And then in the alternative side, we have all these hoaxers and people like that saying, I'm Edgar Cayce and stuff like that. So it's the worst possible reality, because you have the mainstream thing that just rejects anything that's really psychic. Then you have the groups themselves not having the boldness to display their true traditions. And then you have these idiots in the alternative media who are like, I'm reincarnated. Hey, you have to pay attention to me. So I think we need to clean up that scene. And we're well on our way to seeing a different type of independent media around these subjects. And because we have some of the greatest stuff in the world. And I always take time out to mention who are some of the greatest, like Catherine Austin Fitz at Solari. It's incredible work. Dr. Joseph Farrell, who we're having back on in January. These are amazing people doing amazing work now.
When is Joseph coming?
Well, we're not going to announce it yet, but
okay.
it's going to be in January for sure.
All right.
And we're going deep with Joseph. Gigi Young, who's in the chat, my God, some of the greatest work out there. And she's done some amazing work with me here on the X series. And Forbidden Knowledge TV, Alexandra Bruce. I mean, boy, what a brain trust that we have. And let's move forward. Let's get behind those people. Sign up for the show. Get behind it. Get a subscription for Dark Journalist. That supports the show. It's the best way to keep the real information coming your way. And I go out of my way to support a number of different shows and things. I think it's a way to move that energy. And so never be shy.
Okay. So Bruce Banner 5280.
Yes.
So he says basically that Steiner agreed with the flat Earth theory.
No, he didn't. No, he didn't.
Okay. Could you address that just a minute?
No, I mean, he's talking about spheres and planets, so he's not talking about flat Earth.
Okay.
But I do think that's funny because, you're welcome to point out and anywhere where you think that takes place, and you can email it to me at info@darkjournalist.com. I'll check it out.
Yeah, the other thing is, while we're on addresses, if somebody wanted to send you a payment rather than using the subscribe link, would it have through PayPal, or how did the PayPal?
Yeah, no, address? You can subscribe. That's one, and that's at darkjournalist.com. Just go to the subscribe button. You can you can use paypal.me/darkjournalist just to make a contribution. And then finally, you can, the address is up there on the contribute page if you want to send a check. Those are the best ways to do it. And getting behind the show, supporting the show, this is the year to do it. We're going to bring forward such ambitious stuff this year. Like, if there's ever been a time to really make sure that you're on board with it. And members are going to get fantastic results. We've kept it very inexpensive because I want everybody on board. So yeah, let's make sure that we get behind it. I always say that, when it comes to this material now in the period that we're in, procrastination isn't it. And that's for me too. Like, I get behind things now and just jump in and support the things that are good. And that's the way that it has to be. We have a lot of people up and coming, there's going to be fantastic work coming forward. And I've mentioned some of it here. But of course, we're seeing great people now on Twitter also really support the program. And, I see Kate out there, Deep State Kate. She does amazing, amazing stuff. And all the fantastic people that we have looking at this. There's a shout out to a cult fan who does great work. David Donaway, of course, makes the ideas room, the chat here, something really to behold. When there's a pre-chat session, you'll always find him in there. These are fabulous, great ideas that we can all pull forward, much better than the circus that we see out there on the alternative side very often. And I think the whole quality of the place can come up significantly if we just support the right stuff and get behind it. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay, yeah. Tony Rigdon says, subscribe, yo. So there.
I like that. Subscribe, yo. He's got the quote of the night.
Yeah, I know, totally. All right, so
my soul on fire out there. It's good to see you. And I did I see earlier? Well, Najat was out there. It's great.
Oh, Najat's going to get the next question. I've got to fit this in here.
Okay.
So could Ahriman and Yahweh be one and the same to help pull souls on the 8th sphere? Yeah, where does Yahweh fit into this?
No. Actually, very, very different.
Okay.
Yahweh is predominantly in Steiner's work. He is he's one of these watchers who basically guides humanity, and that Yahweh's not God. This is the thing, and that Yahweh was a very important one of these higher figures during the early evolution of humanity, and made huge sacrifices for humanity in that period. But a lot of this kind of early version of Yahweh and a lot of the things that are left behind there, we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's very interesting because the New Testament has really grown up spiritually. In the Old Testament, they're still chopping people's heads off, and it's a very tough setup. So I think the way to look at it really is that you have this kind of savage period during the Moses era, and you have the lawgiver, comes in and creates these rules and creates this entire situation. But there's great information back there. And, one of the things I had to do as a kid was read the Bible. And it's loaded with esoteric information, and it's loaded with some very, very deep concepts. But I would say that in Steiner's work, he does not regard Yahweh as God, but he regards him as one of these watchers over humanity's evolution. And those watchers can make mistakes too. But no, our harmonic forces are darker astral forces than that, by a long shot.
I know this is off topic, but
Okay.
Leilani G is asking, how do you square a jealous God as someone who sacrificed for humanity?
You're going to have to ask Steiner. I mean, I think it's an overall perspective. Just like you find in those early traditions, you have Quetzalcoatl in Kukulkan represented in Mexico. And these are higher beings that improve the culture on one hand and seem to have this dark legacy on the other. And I think we get that a lot with the early religions. And I'm not sure if that's about the state that humanity was in after the Atlantean downfall, that we were open to all these different things. But it seems to me that a lot of them are a mixed bag. But along with that, you're reminding me of something, because we always talk about these wisdom bringers, and we did a show on it. I think we did the show with Gigi about these wisdom bringers who had this bag as a steganography, and we track them all over. And of course, Graham Hancock has done great work tracking this, but we really concentrated on it in terms of the steganography. And now they're doing an episode on the bag in Ancient Aliens, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you were the one who pointed that out to me. Did you see that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. What about it? What did you think of it?
Well, they were watching the show.
Oh, well, yeah, we've had this problem with Ancient Aliens before, but hey. No, but that information, if they do a good job with it, so much the better. But it is interesting that, the concepts are coming out. Look, one of the main things that they brought forward about artificial intelligence was that they just caught an artificial intelligence machine cheating. And what did it cheat with? Steganography. It was using steganography to fool the host. So it's already developing the brain to use it. But what is it actually doing? It's using steganography to do it. So you see, it's very odd the way these things are pushing out into the culture. Look, the hardcore fact of the X series is this, that we brought out a number of things in relation to John Trump, who's Donald Trump's uncle, and his relation to the mystery schools, and how he was part of, he was mentored by Vannevar Bush, who's the head of the UFO file. And Trump goes out of his way to talk about how close he and his uncle were. So is he signaling, you guys, I know so much about the UFO file, don't mess with me? Or is he literally reminiscing, and in that reminiscing, giving us that picture of that deeper relationship he had with John Trump? Well, John Trump is a major figure as an MIT engineer. He's known very much because he was called in by the FBI to examine Nikola Tesla, the inventor's papers. But he also worked on the UFO file because he's Vannevar Bush's protege. So, we go deep there. And when we talk about the UFO file, some of the information that we got from physicist Robert Sarbacher before he died was that John von Neumann took over the UFO file for 10 years, from the 50s to the 60s. Well, that's where the singularity comes from. According to Ray Kurzweil, he got it from von Neumann. Okay, so now we're come face to face with these people over and over again. And we did of course, an episode in October on Halloween on the CERN tarot cards, and there was von Neumann right in the middle of the tarot cards. So what is it about these people? What is it that we don't understand? This is the innovation of what we're doing with the X series, and that's why it's important. And it's definitely an interactive, interpenetrable situation too, because I want to give you so much ideas, but you guys are also giving me the feedback on it, and that makes it this kind of interesting chemistry that we're getting together. And I think that's what really makes the show special. Okay, we'll take the last two questions.
Okay, Leslie Patton, does DJ now know who is fighting the good fight against the dark forces now?
Well, I've listed some of them here. I think the work that's coming to us on the alternative side through some of the people that I've mentioned, like Fitz and like Dr. Joseph Farrell, there's a lot of material there to work with. And it's something that wasn't available really a decade ago. I can tell you, this is a very unique period in time. And, Catherine Austin Fitz and her work around the missing trillions probably becomes the single most important political issue of our time. Where did the $21 trillion go? Because then we're getting into where the black budget rules the situation. So these are the people, and they're making the moves. There's no question about it.
I think actually it's a more esoteric question. The
Okay.
good forces versus the dark forces.
Well, there's good forces everywhere. There's no question about it. And, just because we gear up for battle very often on the show, pointing things out, it does not mean that we don't acknowledge the great, incredible things that we have. The legacy from the mystery schools itself, if we can enact their legacy that they've left for us, it's an incredible gift that's been vouchsafed for us. And this is the kind of thing that I think we can take time to consider when we look back and we spend a little time on their material. We really start to understand that they're building a bridge to a better world. And really, I think that's what we're all after in the end, along with that knowledge and wisdom. Okay, we'll take one more question.
Emmanuel Barron, is Star Wars a prophecy?
Well, it's so interesting because it was a past myth, right? It was set far, far away, long
time ago. And
this is the thing about it, and that these things repeat themselves in cycles. When we talk about Atlantis rising, the real power of Atlantis rising is it reminds us of who we are. And as Bimini is the center of Atlantis rising, according to Edgar Cayce, and we have this incredible drama about Cuba and the city off of Cuba, we see that we're in this period that was talked about, and that there's an echo there giving us an idea that back then they had this incredible clash, and it was around the technology, and it was around the incredible forces, is the way Cayce describes it, the sons of Emilius and the sons of Belial, and the way that those forces play off against each other. The Emilius forces, the one forces, they were looking to use the technology to spiritually interface with the higher beings and bring down a higher spirit here to Earth. By the way, that whole thing about bringing it down here, it's very interesting. It comes up in Steiner's work. And the Belial groups very simply saw that they could physically dominate with the technology itself. And I don't think that they did it in such a nuts and bolts way. I mean, I think very often a lot of what they're doing is influencing the minds and souls. It's not just that they can fire that laser anywhere. I think they had incredible control in the Atlantean period, and we see this coming back again. The mystery schools have intimated that many of these people who are coming back and controlling things and pushing the technology all were from Atlantis in this period where they blew themselves up, essentially. So here we are right in the middle of it. Many of us were there also. So it's quite a drama. It's a fascinating play of humanity, shall we say.
The thing I find upsetting about the way Star Wars interfaces with this time period is that we're very much getting that kind of technology, but we are not. I mean, I feel like humanity is awakening to their spiritual potential, but just beginning. So it's not an even. We don't have the forces balanced right now.
Oh, no, absolutely.
So, I mean, they had a whole tradition of Jedi with psychic abilities and training, and we have none of that. So we're trying to get caught up very, very quickly here.
Yeah, well, but we have the mystery schools. They have the legacy. So I think in essence, when you get right down to it, I'm going to make this real simple. Here's my simple way to end it. We've got this versus this. So I think the challenge is clear. And as far as I'm concerned, they left in their material, in their tradition, the instructions for that particular battle. And I think that's what we're learning in the X series is the great tradition and really the legacy of the mystery schools, but not just as an ancient thing, but something that we can enact right now. And by the way, the mystery schools haven't gone away. I mean, they're very active, extremely active, but it's not the kind of things, very often it's like we hear, oh, hey, the aliens are going to save us from nuclear destruction. the mystery schools don't save us. The aliens don't save us. The aliens are peers, right? That's the way we should think of them. If there's an off-world civilization visiting, they're peers. They're not gods. So the idea of being saved is absurd. But I would say that as far as it goes, we need this idea that the mystery schools, they've laid it out there. They've laid out a number of tools for us and experiences and people. So it's up to us now. And this part of that process is us learning about it and discussing it like we're doing on this program. I'll take one more, Olivia.
Okay, well, this is something very hot right now. Marco Zerpa,
yes,
the Dark Overlord hacker group,
yes,
has released decryption keys for 650 documents.
Yes.
It says are related to 9/11. Do
Been
you
watching
want to
it
talk
closely.
about that story?
Not on this show. In an upcoming show, we are, because we want to make sure that the group, the Dark Overlord group, are who they say they are. But I will say this: there are so many documents that would help explain what really happened on 9/11. That is a threat that I think the entire establishment would shudder just at the thought that some of that material would come out. It's a fascinating situation, and we'll watch it. I don't know whether to put any stock in it yet.
How much are they asking for?
Oh, I don't know, but it's all in Bitcoin, which I find.
I feel like we should come up with the money ourselves, and
No.
So they release it. It's just, I
know.
make it happen.
No, if they have the information, they shouldn't be holding it
Well, of
for
course
hostage. But I don't know anything about them or.
They're not philanthropic.
No, I don't know what their motives are, but I will say it's interesting, and I'm glad the story got brought up anyway. And if they have material that they want to bring out that way, maybe it's part of their program. So I'm not going to criticize what they're doing. I just don't know what it is. I think it's fascinating. It could very well be a crack in that official story. And let me tell you, the rules around dark journalism are the official story, the counter story, and the junk conspiracy. Well, we've had a lot of the official story. We've had a lot of the junk conspiracy. We need the real story, the counter story in the middle. And that's for sure. But wow, I'm so glad they brought that up, because I've been looking at that, and it's I think 9/11 is something that has been completely whitewashed. And if you look at it, the culture went down hard for like a decade during the terror wars after 9/11, and we're still under a state of emergency, by the way. Just check out The American Deep State by Peter Dale Scott, and you get a good handle on what that is. But we still exist under a state of emergency that every president since G.W. Bush renews every year, ever since that incident happened. So lifting that state of emergency would help restore a normal constitutional balance to the country. And with that, I am going to...
Well, I just wanted to add,
Yes.
The real, what it is the psychic trauma.
Yeah.
So it's the layers of psychic trauma.
Yes.
So the fact that they continue to lie, we know, it's just like Kennedy's assassination. We know the truth, but it's what is the term? Adding insult to injury.
Yeah. Oh,
so
absolutely.
that, and it just is going on, and it is killing the soul of America.
Well, you can't build on a foundation of a lie for a productive country. So a number of countries have at times, the media is the predominant gatekeeper on the Kennedy assassination, on 9/11. And they've spun it their way in order to protect the establishment. But those stories are absolutely important. That's why we cover them here. Look, you still can't get Kennedy documents from an assassination that took place 55 years ago. Think about that. How free is your country? That's problematic, I think, from any standpoint. And we'll continue to cover that. Wow, what an amazing show. What amazing questions. Olivia, unbelievable.
It's great. I have so much on the meaning of 8 from different angles.
Okay.
We're going to this will not be our last show. On
No.
Well,
The
by any means.
The 8th sphere is ongoing. You can't capture it in one, but I think we put Steiner a little more on the record tonight. And that's always the important thing, because he has so much work, and his work is so valuable. I highly recommend it. Now, I want to recommend also that everyone go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. Keep us in touch with each other. We will come back next Friday with a powerful program. January is loaded with amazing guests and more than one surprise. It's great having everyone here. I want to shout out to a couple of people before we go away. It's great. Esoteric 369, fantastic. It's great to see you. And also, I wanted to say that some great questions coming in at the end, too. Thanks so much. Jim Roy, the Heretic, great questions tonight. Thanks so much. Thomas Tyson, as always, excellent. And Olivia, of course, the question of the night, what's for dinner?
We're going to have like a double, maybe triple cheese pizza.
That sounds good.
I can't wait.
Triple.
Yeah, I'm feeling the cheese.
That sounds good. Well, you know, you got threes.
It's been a tough week, and I deserve it. Damn it.
Yeah. Hey, listen, no one's going to argue with that. We will see you next Friday at 7 p.m. And have a great night. Thank you, everyone. And have a fabulous weekend.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Ciao.